Dawn breaks over the waters of the Bosphorus, painting the narrow strait in shades of gold and rose. Here, where Europe meets Asia, where the Black Sea flows into the Mediterranean, lies one of the most storied locations on Earth. The morning mist rises from the water as fishing boats make their way between two continents, their small forms dwarfed by the immensity of history that surrounds them. Picture yourself standing on these ancient shores in the year 324 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, but it is an empire in transformation. For decades, civil wars have torn at its fabric. Emperors rise and fall with alarming frequency. The old gods are giving way to a new faith brought by a carpenter from Nazareth. And here, on this strategic peninsula overlooking the Bosphorus, one man stands contemplating a vision that will reshape the world. That man is Constantine, first Christian emperor of Rome. And what he sees as he gazes across these waters will outlast his own empire by nearly 1,000 years. The location Constantine has chosen is not empty. For over 1,000 years, the Greek city of Byzantium has occupied this commanding position, controlling the vital passage between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Founded by Greek colonists from Megara around 660, before the Common Era, Byzantium has grown wealthy from the tolls it collects from passing ships and the abundant fish that swim through the Golden Horn, the natural harbour that cuts deep into the European shore. But Constantine envisions something far grander than a prosperous Greek trading post. As he surveys the 7 hills that rise from the peninsula, he sees a new Rome, not merely another city in the empire, but a second capital, a Christian Rome that will serve as the eastern anchor of imperial power, while the ancient capital continues to rule the West. The emperor's advisors whisper among themselves, questioning the wisdom of such an ambitious undertaking. Why build a new capital when Rome itself has served for centuries? Why invest enormous resources in distant construction when barbarians press against the frontiers? But Constantine's vision extends beyond immediate concerns. He understands that the empire's center of gravity has been shifting eastward for generations. The wealthiest provinces lie in Asia Minor and Egypt. The most pressing military threats come from Persia. The new faith he has embraced looks toward Jerusalem, not the Tiber. Here, on this triangular peninsula where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, Constantine will create his new Rome, his Constantinople, the city that bears his name. The decision reflects more than strategic calculation. Constantine has experienced something that transcends military logic or economic advantage. Before his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge 12 years earlier, he claims to have seen a vision of the cross blazing in the sky, accompanied by the words in this sign, "Conquer." That vision not only secured his rule over the entire Roman Empire, but marked his conversion to Christianity, making him the first emperor to embrace the faith that earlier rulers had persecuted, Tao. As he plans his new capital, Constantine intends to make it explicitly Christian from its foundation. Unlike Rome, with its pagan temples and traditions stretching back to the legendary Romulus and Remus, this new city will be born Christian. Its churches will rival the greatest buildings of the ancient world. Its emperor will rule not just by virtue of military might or political cunning, but as God's representative on earth. The work begins immediately. Architects and engineers arrive from across the empire, bringing with them the accumulated knowledge of Roman construction. Workmen quarry stone from Asia Minor, marble from the Greek islands, columns from ancient temples that will find new purpose in Christian buildings. Ships carry precious materials up the Bosphorus, porphyry from Egypt, bronze from Cyprus, silver from Spain. As the new city takes shape, its founder ensures that it will be worthy of its imperial destiny. The Hippodrome, capable of seating 100,000 spectators, rises near the palace complex. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, though it will not reach its final magnificent form for another 2 centuries, establishes the spiritual heart of the city. Palaces, baths, forums, and cisterns transform the landscape, while massive walls on the landward side protect the growing metropolis from assault. Constantine populates his new capital with the finest treasures of the ancient world. The serpent column, created to commemorate the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea, arrives from Delphi. Obelisks from Egypt grace the Hippodrome. Statues and artworks from across the Mediterranean find new homes in the forums and squares of Constantinople. On May 11th, 330, Constantine formally dedicates his new capital. The ceremonies blend Christian and Roman traditions, creating something unprecedented in the ancient world. Here begins the story of an empire that will call itself Roman while speaking Greek, that will preserve classical learning while embracing Christian faith, that will stand as the last remnant of ancient Rome while evolving into something entirely new. As you drift toward sleep, imagine those first citizens of Constantinople awakening in their new city, watching the sun rise over the Bosphorus, unaware that they are witnessing the birth of an empire that will endure for more than 11 centuries, surviving the fall of Rome itself, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, and countless other challenges that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. The echo of Constantine's dedication ceremony still resonates through the marble corridors of the new capital as the empire enters its most transformative period. Those early citizens who witnessed the birth of Constantinople could not have imagined that they were watching the foundation of a civilization that would outlive Rome itself by nearly 1,000 years. Yet even as they celebrated their city's inauguration, the seeds of that extraordinary longevity were already taking root in the rich soil of Byzantine innovation. Constantine himself lives only 7 more years after founding his city, but those years prove crucial in establishing the character of what will become the Byzantine Empire. The emperor who bridged the pagan and Christian worlds spends his final years refining the administrative machinery that will govern his eastern capital. He creates a new senate, though one that lacks the deep traditions and accumulated power of its Roman counterpart. He establishes a praefectus urbi, an urban prefect responsible for the daily governance of the growing city. Most importantly, he begins the process of attracting the empire's most talented administrators, soldiers, and scholars to his new Rome. When Constantine dies in 337, baptized on his deathbed according to Christian custom, the empire faces the familiar challenge of succession. His 3 surviving sons divide the Roman world among themselves, but this partition proves temporary. Constantine's nephew Julian, who will become known to history as Julian the Apostate, briefly reunites the empire under his rule and attempts to restore the old gods. For 2 years, from 361 to 363, it seems as though the Christian transformation of the empire might be reversed. Temples reopen, sacrifices resume, and the bishop's influence at court diminishes. But Julian's death in a Persian campaign ends this pagan revival as abruptly as it began. The empire returns to Christian rule, and Constantinople continues its evolution as a Christian capital. Under Julian's successors, the churches Constantine had begun take on their final form. The city's Christian identity becomes not merely official policy, but lived reality, woven into the daily rhythms of its inhabitants. The most significant transformation comes under Theodosius I, who rules from 379 to 395. This Spanish-born emperor, the last to rule both halves of the Roman Empire, makes decisions that will echo through the centuries. In 380, he issues the Edict of Thessalonica, making Nicene Christianity the official religion of the entire Roman Empire. No longer merely tolerated or favored, Christianity becomes the sole legitimate faith, with pagan practices officially banned and their temples closed. But Theodosius's most consequential decision comes at the end of his reign, recognizing the impossibility of governing an empire that stretches from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates. He divides it permanently between his two young sons. Arcadius, barely 18, receives the east, with Constantinople as his capital. Honorius, even younger, at 11, inherits the west, with its seat at Ravenna. Neither emperor proves particularly capable, but the administrative division they inherit will prove remarkably enduring. What emerges in the east is something subtly different from what has come before. While the emperors in Constantinople continue to call themselves Roman, their empire begins to develop its own distinct character. Greek, always the language of commerce and scholarship in the Eastern Mediterranean, gradually replaces Latin in official documents. The Senate of Constantinople, though it lacks the ancient prestige of Rome's, begins to develop its own traditions and influence. The Patriarch of Constantinople, claiming authority second only to the Pope in Rome, becomes a powerful figure in both religious and political affairs. Under Arcadius and his successors, Constantinople grows into a true imperial capital. The population swells to perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The Mazi, the great processional avenue that runs from the Million Milestone to the Golden Gate, becomes lined with shops, churches, and monuments. The palace complex expands to rival anything in Rome, while the Hippodrome emerges as the social and political heart of the city, where emperors display their largesse and citizens voice their opinions through organized cheering factions. Reign of Theodosius II, who rules from 408 to 450, marks a crucial period in the development of Byzantine institutions. Though he ascends the throne as a child and never proves a particularly energetic ruler, his long reign provides the stability necessary for institutional growth. Under his auspices, the famous walls of Constantinople are constructed between 408 and 413. These massive fortifications, stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, create an almost impregnable barrier on the city's landward side. For over 1,000 years, no enemy will successfully breach these walls by force. Theodosius II also establishes the University of Constantinople in 425, creating the first state-sponsored institution of higher learning in Christian Europe. The university attracts scholars from across the Mediterranean world, making Constantinople a center of learning that rivals Alexandria and Athens. Here, the classical heritage of Greece and Rome is preserved and transmitted, even as it is transformed by Christian thought and Byzantine innovation. Perhaps most significantly, Theodosius II commissions the Codex Theodosianus, a comprehensive compilation of Roman law that serves as a bridge between classical jurisprudence and the great legal achievements of later Byzantine emperors. This legal work demonstrates the continuity between Old Rome and New, showing how Constantinople's rulers see themselves as legitimate heirs to Roman tradition, even as they adapt that tradition to new circumstances. The middle decades of the 5th century bring unprecedented challenges as the Western Roman Empire crumbles under barbarian pressure. The Visigoths sack Rome in 410. The Vandals repeat the feat In 455, Germanic kingdoms established themselves in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. In 476, the Germanic chieftain, Odoacer, deposes the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople as a gesture of nominal submission. Throughout this period of Western collapse, the Eastern Empire not only survives, but thrives. The Danube frontier holds against barbarian incursions. The wealthy provinces of Asia Minor and Egypt continue to provide the tax revenue that funds the imperial administration. Trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean remain secure, ensuring Constantinople's prosperity. While Rome becomes a shadow of its former self, Constantinople grows, ever more magnificent. The Emperor Leo I, who reigns from 457 to 474, establishes another crucial precedent when he becomes the first emperor to be crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, rather than by military acclamation or senatorial approval. This ceremony, held in the Church of the Holy Apostles, creates a new model of imperial legitimacy that combines Roman political tradition with Christian religious authority. Future Byzantine emperors will be crowned by the Patriarch, creating a sacred dimension to imperial power that helps distinguish Eastern from Western concepts of authority. Under Leo's successors, the institutional framework of the Byzantine Empire reaches maturity. The Scali Palatine elite guard units that replace the old Praetorian Guard provide security for the emperor while avoiding the political interference that had plagued earlier imperial regimes. The logothete, a chief financial officer, oversees the complex system of taxation and expenditure that funds the empire's administration. Theme system armies, though they will not reach full development for another century, begin to take shape as a more effective alternative to the expensive and unreliable barbarian federates employed by the Western Empire. The Senate of Constantinople develops its own ceremonial traditions and advisory functions, while the city's trade guilds become powerful economic and political forces. The circus factions, originally organized supporters of different chariot racing teams, evolve into quasi-political parties that provide a channel for popular opinion in an otherwise autocratic system. The Blues and Greens, the two dominant factions, develop elaborate hierarchies and rituals that mirror the imperial court itself by the early 6th century. As the reign of Anastasius I draws to a close, the transformation is complete. What began as Constantine's new Rome has become something unprecedented in world history, a Christian empire that combines Roman administrative efficiency with Greek cultural sophistication, Eastern religious mysticism with Western political pragmatism. The city that Constantine founded as a second Rome has grown into the capital of what is effectively a new civilization. As you drift deeper into contemplation of these transformative centuries, picture the citizens of Constantinople as they go about their daily lives in this remarkable city. Merchants from India and China unload their goods at the harbors along the Golden Horn. Scholars debate theological questions in the shadow of Hagia Sophia. Senators process through the streets in their silk robes, while artisans perfect the techniques that will make Byzantine art and architecture legendary. The emperor receives ambassadors from kingdoms as distant as Ethiopia and Britain, conducting the intricate diplomatic dance that keeps his empire secure. The foundation years have ended. The empire has survived its first great test, outlasting the Western Roman Empire that gave it birth. Now, as the 6th century dawns, Constantinople stands ready for its golden age under an emperor who will be remembered as one of history's greatest rulers. The peasant's son named Justinian approaches the throne. carrying dreams of reconquest that will almost restore the ancient Roman Empire's full glory. The imperial purple settles upon the shoulders of a man whose origins could hardly be more humble. In the summer of 527, as Justinian I ascends the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire, few could have predicted that this nephew of an Illyrian peasant would become one of history's most ambitious rulers. Yet, as the new emperor stands in the great palace of Constantinople, gazing out over the Bosphorus toward the territories his ancestors once ruled, a vision burns within him that will reshape the Mediterranean world. Justinian's path to power reads like a tale from another age. Born Petrus Sabatius in a small village in what is now North Macedonia, he owes his elevation to his uncle Justin, an illiterate peasant turned palace guard who somehow maneuvered his way to the imperial throne. Justin, recognizing his own limitations, had brought his intelligent nephew to Constantinople for education and advancement. The young man who took the name Justinianus proved himself a master of both scholarship and political intrigue, serving as his uncle's closest advisor and eventual heir. But Justinian's most fateful decision comes not in matters of state, but of the heart. Against all precedent and propriety, he marries Theodora, an actress from the Hippodrome whose past scandals have made her a figure of controversy throughout the capital. In an age when emperors typically choose wives from established noble families, Justinian's selection of a woman from the theatre district shocks Byzantine society. Actresses occupy the lowest rungs of respectability, often little better than prostitutes in public estimation, yet Theodora proves to be far more than her critics imagine. Intelligent, ruthless, and utterly devoted to her husband's success, she becomes not merely Empress Buta, secondariola in all but name. Together they form a partnership that will drive the empire to heights not seen since the days of Constantine himself. Where Justinian provides vision and administrative brilliance, Theodora supplies steel-willed determination and political cunning that often surpasses even her husband's. Considerable skills, their partnership faces its first great test just 5 years after Justinian's accession to power. In January 532, what begins as routine rivalry between the blue and green circus factions explodes into the most serious internal crisis the empire has yet faced. The Nika riots, named for the cry of victory that echoes through Constantinople's streets, nearly bring down the Justinian dynasty before it can truly begin. The immediate cause seems trivial. Several members of both factions have been condemned to death for murder, and when the hangman's rope breaks twice, the crowd interprets this as divine intervention demanding clemency. But beneath this surface incident lies deeper resentment. Justinian's tax policies, necessary to fund his ambitious plans, have pressed heavily upon all classes of society. His efforts to suppress corruption have angered entrenched interests. His promotion of merit over birth has disturbed the traditional aristocracy. For 6 days, Constantinople burns. The mob, united across factional lines in their opposition to Justinian's rule, controls the streets while the emperor huddles in his palace. They proclaim a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of the former emperor, Anastasius. The Senate wavers, some members openly supporting the rebellion, as flames consume much of the city centre, including the original church of Hagia Sophia. It appears that Justinian's reign will end almost before it has begun. In the palace, the emperor's councillors urge flight. Ships wait in the harbour to carry the imperial couple to safety in Asia Minor or Egypt. Gold has been loaded, escape routes planned, but as Justinian himself seems ready to abandon his throne, Theodora rises to deliver words that will echo through Byzantine history. Purple, she declares, referring to the imperial color, makes a fine shroud. She reminds her husband that they who have worn the crown can never truly live as private citizens. Better to die as emperors than to flee as exiles. Her courage shames the men around her into action. If Justinian will not fight for his throne, she will die defending it. Steeled by his wife's resolve, Justinian acts with decisive brutality. His generals Belisarius and Mundus, commanding troops loyal to the emperor, surround the hippodrome where the rebels have gathered to acclaim their new emperor. In a coordinated assault, imperial soldiers storm the great arena. What follows is massacre on an unprecedented scale. By the end of the day, perhaps 30,000 rebels lie dead in the hippodrome, their blood soaking into the sand where gladiators and charioteers once performed. The Nika riots end as suddenly as they began, but they leave Constantinople transformed. Much of the city centre lies in ruins, requiring massive reconstruction. More importantly, Justinian emerges from the crisis with his authority unquestioned, and his ambitions unlimited. He has stared into the abyss of failure and conquered his fear. Now, nothing will restrain his dreams of restoring Roman greatness to its ancient bounds. The reconstruction of Constantinople begins immediately and on a scale that dwarfs even Constantine's original building program. The new church of Hagia Sophia, rising from the ashes of its predecessor, becomes the centerpiece of Justinian's architectural revolution. Working with the brilliant architects Anthemis of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, the emperor creates a building that will stand for over 1,000 years as the greatest church in Christendom. The construction of Hagia Sophia represents more than architectural achievement. It embodies Justinian's vision of imperial power united with divine authority. The great dome, seeming to float weightlessly above the vast interior space, creates an effect that contemporary witnesses describe as heavenly. When sunlight streams through the windows at the dome's base, the entire structure appears to glow with inner light. Glory to God who has thought me worthy to complete such a work, Justinian reportedly declares at the building's dedication. Solomon, I have outdone you. While masons and craftsmen transform Constantinople's skyline, Justinian launches his most ambitious project, the reconquest of the lost Western territories. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa becomes his first target. These Germanic invaders, who had crossed from Spain a century earlier, controlled some of the empire's former richest provinces. Their Arian Christianity marks them as heretics in Orthodox Byzantine eyes, providing religious justification for what might otherwise appear as naked aggression. Belisarius, the general who had proven his loyalty during the Nika riots, receives command of the African expedition. Still in his early 30s, this remarkable soldier combines tactical brilliance with absolute personal loyalty to Justinian. With a force of only 15,000 men loaded aboard 500 ships, he sails from Constantinople in June 533, carrying with him the hopes of imperial restoration. The campaign unfolds with stunning speed. Landing near modern Tunisia, Belisarius defeats the Vandal king Gelamor in 2 decisive battles. Capturing Carthage after barely 3 months of fighting, the Vandal kingdom, which had seemed permanently established, collapses almost overnight. Gelamar, once master of the Western Mediterranean, walks in Belisarius's triumph through the streets of Constantinople, wearing the purple robes that mock his fallen status before being granted comfortable retirement on an Anatolian estate. Success in Africa emboldens Justinian to attempt an even more audacious project, the reconquest of Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom established by Theodoric the Great has fallen into dynastic disputes, providing the perfect opportunity for Byzantine intervention. Once again, Belisarius leads the assault, landing in Sicily in 535, with forces even smaller than those he had commanded in Africa. The Italian campaign proves far more challenging than the African expedition. The Goths, unlike the Vandals, fight with desperate courage for their homeland. Cities change hands repeatedly as the war drags on year after year. Belisarius captures Rome in 536, loses it briefly to Gothic counterattack, then recaptures it after a siege that reduces the Eternal City's population to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. Milan, once a thriving imperial capital, suffers destruction so complete that it will not recover for centuries. The war's turning point comes with the siege of Ravenna in 540. The Gothic capital, protected by marshes and waterways, seems impregnable, until Belisarius employs a combination of blockade and diplomacy that forces the garrison's surrender. The Gothic king Vitiges joins Gelamor in Constantinople as a prisoner, while northern Italy falls under Byzantine control. But Justinian's suspicions about his successful general's loyalty lead to a fateful decision. Despite Belisarius's repeated victories, the emperor recalls him to Constantinople just as the conquest seems complete. This allows the Goths to rally under a new leader, Totila, who proves himself one of the finest generals of the age. For another decade, the war in Italy continues with renewed Gothic resistance, gradually wearing down Byzantine resources. The final phase of the Italian reconquest falls to Narses, an elderly eunuch whose military genius rivals that of Belisarius himself. With a fresh army and imperial backing, Narses systematically reduces Gothic resistance. At the Battle of Tegune in 552, he destroys the last major Gothic army, killing Totila in the process. 2 years later, at Mons Lacturius, the final Gothic king falls in battle, ending their kingdom forever. Meanwhile, Byzantine forces achieve more limited success in Spain, conquering a coastal strip that includes the great port cities of Cartagena and Malaga. For the first time since the 5th century, Roman eagles again cast their shadows across 3 continents. The Mediterranean, which Justinian proudly calls our sea, once again becomes a Roman lake. Yet these military triumphs exact a terrible price. The constant warfare drains the imperial treasury despite the wealth flowing from newly conquered provinces. More devastatingly, a plague sweeps across the empire, beginning in 541, reaching Constantinople in 542. This pandemic, likely bubonic plague carried by rats aboard grain ships from Egypt, kills perhaps 1/3 of the empire's population. Justinian himself falls ill with the plague, lying near death for weeks while the empire teeters on the edge of collapse. Theodora effectively governs alone during this crisis, her strong hand maintaining order when lesser leadership might have allowed the state to fragment. When the emperor recovers, he finds an empire transformed by demographic catastrophe. Villages stand empty, farmland returns to wilderness, and tax revenues plummet as the population struggles to recover from the pandemic's devastation. The plague's aftermath coincides with renewed pressure on the empire's eastern frontier. The Sassanid Persian Empire, traditional rival of Rome since the days of Augustus, launches major offensives into Syria and Asia Minor. Justinian finds himself fighting a 2-front war, desperately trying to hold his new western conquests while defending ancient eastern territories. The strain proves nearly unbearable, forcing him to pay enormous subsidies to Persian kings for temporary truces. Despite these mounting challenges, Justinian's domestic achievements rival his military conquests. The Corpus Juris Civilis, his comprehensive revision of Roman law, becomes his most enduring legacy. Working with the brilliant jurist Tribonian, Justinian creates a legal framework that will influence jurisprudence for over a millennium. The institutes provide basic legal education, the digest compiles the opinions of classical jurists, and the code organizes imperial legislation into a coherent system. This legal revolution makes the complex heritage of Roman law accessible to new generations, while adapting ancient principles to contemporary needs. The emperor's building projects extend far beyond Hagia Sophia. Throughout Constantinople and across the provinces, Justinian constructs churches, palaces, fortifications, and public works on a scale that rivals the greatest achievements of imperial Rome. The monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula, the fortress cities along the Danube frontier, the great cathedral of Ravenna with its stunning mosaics, all bear witness to an era of unprecedented architectural achievement. Yet by the 550s, the weight of Justinian's ambitions begins to tell. The empire's resources, stretched beyond sustainable limits by constant warfare, plague losses, and massive construction projects, show signs of dangerous strain. Tax collection becomes increasingly harsh as administrators struggle to fund imperial policies. The army, despite its victories, suffers from recruitment difficulties as the plague-depleted population cannot provide sufficient manpower for both military service and economic production. Religious controversies add to the empire's burdens. Justinian's efforts to reconcile the monophysite Christians of Egypt and Syria with Orthodox doctrine satisfy neither side, while creating new sources of internal division. His persecution of pagans, Jews, and Christian heretics may ensure doctrinal uniformity, but alienates significant portions of the population. The closing of the Academy of Athens in 529, ending nearly 1,000 years of philosophical instruction, symbolizes the empire's increasing religious intolerance. The final years of Justinian's reign witness a gradual abandonment of his most ambitious goals. The Spanish foothold, never secure, faces constant Visigothic pressure. Northern Italy suffers devastating Lombard invasions that reduce Byzantine control to isolated coastal enclaves. The Danube frontier, weakened by troop withdrawals for western campaigns, allows Slavic and Avar raiders to penetrate deep into imperial territory. Even the emperor's personal life grows troubled as Theodora's death in 548 leaves him increasingly isolated and suspicious. When Justinian dies in November 565, he leaves behind an empire that spans 3 continents, but strains under the weight of its own ambitions. His successors inherit reconquered territories that prove impossible to hold, depleted finances that constrain future options, and administrative systems groaning under the pressure of governing vast distances with insufficient resources. Yet for all its ultimate limitations, Justinian's reign represents the Byzantine Empire's closest approach to its Roman inheritance. For 38 years, the dream of imperial restoration seemed achievable. The Mediterranean really did become a Roman lake once more. Latin law and Greek culture, Christian faith and imperial tradition combined to create a civilization of unprecedented richness and complexity. As you contemplate this extraordinary reign, picture the aged emperor in his final years, walking through the corridors of his great palace, past walls decorated with mosaics celebrating his victories, the weight of purple robes heavy on his shoulders, Justinian might pause before a window overlooking the Bosphorus, watching ships carry goods from Africa and Italy to his capital's markets. He has achieved more than any emperor since Constantine, yet he knows that much of what he built will not long survive his passing. The Golden Age is ending, but its achievements will echo through the centuries. The legal code will outlive the empire itself. Hagia Sophia will stand for nearly 1,000 years as the greatest church in Christendom, and the memory of an emperor who dared to dream of restoring Rome's greatness will inspire his successors long after the practical possibility has vanished, feeding Byzantine ambitions until the very last emperor falls, defending Constantinople's walls. The purple mantle that had rested so heavily upon Justinian's shoulders passes to his nephew, Justin II, in November 565, as the new emperor receives the crown from the Patriarch of Constantinople. He inherits not just the throne, but the crushing burden of his predecessor's ambitions. The empire that Justinian leaves behind stretches impressively across the map, yet beneath its apparent grandeur lies the reality of overextension, depleted resources, and enemies gathering on every frontier like wolves scenting weakness. Justin II's reign begins with an immediate crisis that reveals the fragility of Justinian's reconstructed empire. In northern Italy, a Germanic people called the Lombards, driven from their homes along the Danube by Avar pressure, pour across the Alps in 568 under their king Alboins. Unlike previous barbarian invasions that had been raids or temporary settlements, the Lombard conquest represents a permanent displacement of Byzantine authority. Within 3 years, they control most of the Italian peninsula, reducing the empire's presence to isolated coastal enclaves around Ravenna, Rome, and in the far south. The speed of the Lombard conquest shocks Constantinople. These are not the territories Justinian had reconquered through decades of grinding warfare, lost again almost overnight to a people the Byzantines had previously dismissed as minor barbarians. The wealthy cities of northern Italy, their populations still recovering from the Gothic wars and the plague, offer little resistance to the Lombard advance. Milan, Florence, and scores of other centers that had known Roman rule for centuries now acknowledge Germanic kings. While Italy slips from imperial control, an even greater catastrophe unfolds in the Balkans. The Avars, a nomadic confederation from the Asian steppes, establish themselves north of the Danube and begin launching devastating raids deep into imperial territory. These horseborn warriors, masters of siege warfare learned from Chinese and Persian enemies, prove far more dangerous than the Slavic tribes that had previously troubled the northern frontier. Worse still, the Avars bring with them vast numbers of Slavic allies and subjects. As Avar armies withdraw after each successful raid, Slavic settlers remain behind, gradually transforming the ethnic composition of the Balkans. Villages that had spoken Greek or Latin for centuries now echo with Slavic dialects. Ancient cities are abandoned as their populations flee southward, seeking safety behind Constantinople's walls, or in the defensible coastal regions. The psychological impact of these losses weighs heavily upon Justin II. Contemporary sources describe an emperor increasingly unstable, prone to fits of rage, followed by periods of catatonic withdrawal. The burden of governing an empire under such relentless pressure proves too much for a man who had never been prepared for supreme power. By 574, his mental condition deteriorates so severely that he cannot function as ruler, forcing the appointment of his general Tiberius as Caesar and effective regent. When Justin II dies 4 years later, Tiberius too assumes the purple formally, but inherits an empire in full crisis. The treasury that Justinian had strained to fund his ambitions now stands virtually empty. Military recruitment, already difficult due to plague losses, becomes nearly impossible as provincial populations face constant threats from raiders and invaders. The elaborate administrative system that had governed the reconquered territories begins to break down as communications are severed, and local officials abandon their posts. Tiberius attempts to address these challenges through a combination of military reform and diplomatic innovation. He begins the process of reorganizing the empire's defenses around the theme system, granting land to soldier farmers in exchange for military service. This approach, born of necessity rather than planning, creates more sustainable frontier defenses while reducing the cost of maintaining professional armies. Simultaneously, he pursues complex diplomatic arrangements, playing Avars against Persians and Lombards against Franks in an effort to reduce pressure on imperial frontiers. The succession of Maurice in 582 brings to the throne an emperor with genuine military experience and strategic vision. For 20 years, Maurice fights to stabilize the empire's collapsing frontiers. His campaigns against the Avars achieve limited success, temporarily clearing Slavic raiders from key routes and recovering some abandoned cities. More significantly, his intervention in Persian civil wars, supporting the legitimate Shah Khosrow II against a usurper, secures a favorable peace treaty that returns disputed territories in Armenia and Mesopotamia to imperial control. Yet Marie's reign also reveals the depth of the empire's transformation. The loss of Italy and much of the Balkans has severed connections to Latin-speaking populations that had maintained links to Rome's classical heritage. Greek becomes not merely the preferred language of administration, but increasingly the only language that matters in imperial governance. The Senate of Constantinople, already diminished in authority, becomes little more than a ceremonial body as the emperor relies increasingly on his inner circle of advisors and the growing power of the patriarch. Maurice's military successes come at enormous cost to the imperial treasury and the patience of his subjects. His decision to reduce military pay and extend the campaigning season through winter months creates dangerous unrest among the very soldiers upon whom the empire's survival depends. When he orders the army to winter north of the Danube in 602, enduring the harsh conditions of a frontier campaign rather than returning to warm quarters, the troops finally rebel. The mutiny that destroys Maurice reveals the empire's underlying fragility. Led by a junior officer named Phocas, the rebellious soldiers march on Constantinople, where they find the capital's population equally dissatisfied with Maurice's harsh policies. The emperor, who had fought for 2 decades to preserve the empire, dies along with his sons, murdered by the very people he had sought to protect. Phocas, elevated by popular acclaim and military support, becomes emperor through one of the most successful coups in Byzantine history. But Phocas proves a disaster as ruler. His reign of terror, marked by executions, confiscations, and paranoid persecution of real and imagined enemies, destroys what remains of the empire's internal cohesion. The Persian Shah Khosrow II, claiming to avenge his former ally, Maurice, launches a massive invasion that overwhelms weakened imperial defenses. Persian armies that had been held in check for decades now advance virtually unopposed through Syria and Asia Minor. The depth of the empire's collapse under Phocas becomes clear as Persian forces reach the Bosphorus itself in 610. For the first time since the 3rd century, enemy armies camp within sight of Constantinople's walls. The empire that had spanned 3 continents under Justinian now consists of little more than the capital city and a few scattered enclaves. Tax revenues disappear as provinces fall to Persian occupation. The army dissolves as unpaid soldiers desert or switch sides. Even the church wavers in its support as ecclesiastical properties face confiscation to fund focuses increasingly desperate measures. Salvation comes from an unexpected source. Heraclius, son of the imperial governor of Africa, arrives at Constantinople with a fleet and a small but loyal army. The capital's population, driven to desperation by Phocas's tyranny, welcomes the invader as a liberator. Phocas, abandoned even by his bodyguards, faces execution while Heraclius assumes the purple in October 610. The new emperor inherits a situation that appears hopeless. Persian armies control most of Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine. Jerusalem falls in 614, with the true cross carried off as a trophy to the Persian capital at Ctesiphon. Egypt, the empire's richest province and primary source of grain for Constantinople's population, submits to Persian occupation in 618. For the first time since Alexander's conquests, a Persian empire extends from the Indus to the Mediterranean, yet Heraclius proves himself one of history's most remarkable comeback artists. Rather than attempting to defend what remains of his territories, he adopts a strategy of calculated risk that stakes everything on a single campaign. Leaving Constantinople, itself defended by the Patriarch and a skeleton garrison, he takes the field personally at the head of a reconstructed army, launching a desperate invasion of the Persian heartland. The campaigns of 622 to 628 read like something from an earlier, heroic age. Heraclius leads his forces through the mountains of Armenia and Anatolia, striking at targets hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. At the Battle of Nineveh in December 627, his army destroys the main Persian force, opening the road to Ctesiphon itself. The psychological impact proves as important as the military victory. Khosroth II, the great king who had seemed on the verge of conquering the known world, falls to a palace coup, murdered by his own son who immediately sues for peace. The treaty signed in 628 restores all conquered territories to imperial control and returns the true cross to Jerusalem. Heraclius's triumphal entry into the Holy City in 630, personally carrying the most sacred relic of Christendom back to its rightful place, seems to mark the empire's complete restoration. Contemporary chroniclers describe the emperor's victory as miraculous, a demonstration of divine favor for the Christian empire against its Zoroastrian enemies. But even as Heraclius enjoys his triumph, new storm clouds gather on the empire's southern horizon. The Arabian Peninsula, long dismissed by both Romans and Persians as a trackless waste inhabited by quarreling tribes, has been united under the banner of a new faith. Muhammad's followers, inspired by his revelations and organized by his successors, begin expanding beyond their desert homeland with startling speed and success. The exhausted empires that emerge from their mutual destruction provide inviting targets for Arab expansion. Persian resistance collapses entirely after the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636, with the last Sassanid Shah fleeing eastward as his kingdom disintegrates. Byzantine forces, despite their recent victories, prove equally unable to resist the Arab advance. At the Battle of Yarmouk in August 636, the empire's main field army suffers catastrophic defeat, opening Syria and Palestine to Arab conquest. The loss of these provinces, so recently recovered from Persian occupation, devastates imperial finances and morale. Jerusalem, which Heraclius had entered in triumph, just 6 years earlier, submits to the Caliph Umar in 638. Damascus, Antioch, and the other great cities of Syria acknowledge Arab rule. By 642, Arab forces complete the conquest of Egypt, depriving the empire of its wealthiest province and forcing the evacuation of Alexandria after nearly 1,000 years of Greek and Roman rule. The speed of these losses shocks contemporaries. Provinces that had remained loyal through centuries of Roman rule submit to Arab administration within months of conquest. The efficiency of Arab governance, combined with lower tax burdens and religious tolerance for Christian and Jewish populations, makes their rule preferable to the harsh demands of Heraclius' war-exhausted regime. By 650, the Byzantine Empire has contracted to Asia Minor, Constantinople, scattered Italian enclaves, and portions of the Balkans where Slavic settlement has not completely displaced imperial authority. The Mediterranean, Justinian's Roman lake, now accommodates Arab fleets that challenge Byzantine naval supremacy. The empire that had dreamed of universal dominion finds itself reduced to defending its very existence. Yet, survival itself becomes a form of victory as the empire demonstrates remarkable resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Constantine IV, ascending the throne in 668, faces the ultimate test when Arab forces launch their most ambitious assault on Constantinople itself. The siege that begins in 674 represents more than military conflict. It becomes a clash between civilizations. Christianity against Islam, the last remnant of Roman greatness against the dynamic force of Arab expansion. For 4 years, Arab armies and fleets maintain a blockade of Constantinople, seeking to starve the city into submission. The massive walls constructed under Theodosius II prove their worth, repelling assault after assault. But the siege's outcome depends not on fortifications alone, but on a secret weapon that will become legendary throughout the medieval world: Greek fire, an incendiary compound whose exact composition remains mysterious even today, transforms naval warfare at the most critical moment. Byzantine ships equipped with flame-throwing siphons wreak havoc among Arab vessels, setting entire fleets ablaze with substances that burn even on water. The psychological impact proves as devastating as the physical destruction, as Arab sailors face an enemy who appears to command the very elements. The siege's failure in 678 marks a turning point in the Arab expansion. For the first time since Muhammad's revelations, the forces of Islam meet decisive defeat. The 30-year truce that follows provides breathing space for imperial recovery while demonstrating that the Roman Empire, however reduced, retains the capacity to defend itself against any enemy. The final challenge of this era of crisis comes from an unexpected direction. Leo III, who seizes power in 717 just as another Arab army approaches Constantinople, not only repels this second great siege, but launches a religious revolution that will convulse the empire for over a century. His prohibition of religious images in 726 begins the iconoclastic controversy, dividing the empire between supporters and opponents of religious art. Greek fire, an incendiary compound whose exact composition remains mysterious even today, transforms naval warfare at the most critical moment. Byzantine ships equipped with flame-throwing siphons wreak havoc among Arab vessels, setting entire fleets ablaze with substances that burn even on water. The psychological impact proves as devastating as the physical destruction, as Arab sailors face an enemy who appears to command the very elements. The siege's failure in 678 marks a turning point In the Arab expansion, for the first time since Muhammad's revelations, the forces of Islam meet decisive defeat. The 30-year truce that follows provides breathing space for imperial recovery while demonstrating that the Roman Empire, however reduced, retains the capacity to defend itself against any enemy. The final challenge of this era of crisis comes from an unexpected direction. Leo III, who seizes power in 717, just as another Arab army approaches Constantinople, not only repels this second great siege, but launches a religious revolution that will convulse the empire for over a century. His prohibition of religious images in 726 begins the iconoclastic controversy, dividing the empire between supporters and opponents of religious arts. You drift toward contemplation of these tumultuous centuries. Picture the citizens of Constantinople awakening each morning, uncertain whether their city will survive another day. Through plague and invasion, siege and civil war, they maintain their faith in the empire's divine protection. The walls that Constantine built continue to shelter them. The churches that Justinian erected still echo with their prayers. And somehow, against all odds, the Roman Empire endures, transformed but unbroken, ready to face whatever challenges the centuries ahead might bring. The religious fires ignited by Leo III's iconoclastic policies continue to burn through the empire for more than a century, consuming not only countless works of art, but also the stability of the imperial throne itself. Emperor after emperor rises and falls, each taking sides in the bitter controversy over religious images. Icons are destroyed and restored, banned and celebrated, as the empire tears itself apart over questions that seem to matter more than survival itself. Yet from this chaos of religious strife and political instability emerges one of the most remarkable transformations in Byzantine history in the year 867. As autumn shadows lengthen across the courtyards of the great palace, a man named Basil kneels before the altar of Hagia Sophia to receive the imperial crown. His path to this moment reads like a tale from another world, born to Armenian peasants in the mountains of Anatolia. Basil has risen through cunning, strength, and sheer determination from groom in the imperial stables to confidant of emperors. His powerful frame, scarred by years of manual labor, bears little resemblance to the refined courtiers who typically surround the throne. The circumstances of Basil's elevation reveal both the empire's weakness and its persistent vitality. The previous emperor, Michael III, had elevated his favorite to the position of co-emperor in a moment of drunken generosity, never imagining that his protege would soon arrange his murder. Yet Basil's coup, brutal though it appears, serves a deeper purpose. The empire requires strong leadership to navigate the treacherous currents of religious controversy and external threats. The peasant who becomes emperor understands, perhaps better than his aristocratic predecessors, what the empire needs to survive. Basil I's first crucial decision addresses the iconoclastic crisis that has divided the empire for over a century. In 843, 24 years before his accession, the Empress Theodora had already restored the veneration of icons, ending the second and final phase of iconoclasm. But the wounds inflicted by decades of religious persecution remain fresh. Monasteries lie in ruins, their libraries scattered or destroyed. Artistic traditions have been broken. Theological learning has stagnated as scholars feared to express opinions that might be deemed heretical. Basil recognizes that healing these divisions requires more than imperial decrees. He launches a systematic program of reconciliation that restores confiscated monastic properties, rebuilds destroyed churches, and encourages the creation of new religious arts. More importantly, he begins the process of legal and administrative reform that will establish the foundation for the empire's coming renaissance. The Basilica Basil's revision of Justinian's legal code adapts classical Roman law to the changed circumstances of the medieval empire, written in Greek rather than Latin, reflecting the empire's linguistic transformation. This legal compilation governs Byzantine society for centuries to come. Its provisions reveal an empire that has learned hard lessons from its recent trials. Military service receives greater emphasis and reward. Religious orthodoxy becomes a requirement for citizenship. Provincial administration adopts more flexible structures that can respond quickly to local threats. Yet Basil's most significant legacy lies not in his own achievements, but in founding a dynasty that will rule the empire for nearly 2 centuries. The Macedonian dynasty, despite its name, actually originates in Armenia, but its members will preside over the empire's most brilliant medieval flowering. Under their rule, Constantinople becomes once again a beacon of learning and culture that draws scholars and artists from across the known world. The transformation becomes evident during the reign of Basil's son, Leo VI, known to history as Leo the Wise. Though physically frail and temperamentally scholarly, Leo presides over a remarkable cultural revival. The imperial court patronizes historians like Theophanes Continuatus, whose chronicles preserve the memory of earlier emperors. Theological scholars emerge from the shadows of iconoclastic persecution to produce sophisticated works that synthesize classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. Artists and craftsmen, released from the constraints that had prohibited religious imagery, create new masterpieces that blend traditional Byzantine techniques with innovative approaches to form and content. Leo's own contribution to this renaissance comes through his legal writings. The basilica receives further refinement under his supervision, while his military manual, the Toktika, codifies the strategic knowledge that enables the empire's armies to hold their frontiers against Arab, Bulgarian, and other threats. More personally, his relationship with his fourth wife, Zoe Carbonopsina, creates a succession crisis that will influence imperial politics for decades. The Church's opposition to fourth marriages leads to a schism that reveals the growing power of the Patriarch of Constantinople in imperial affairs. The reign of Leo's son, Constantine the Eleventh Porphyrogenitus, marks the cultural zenith of the Macedonian Renaissance. Born to the purple in the sacred chamber of the Great Palace, Constantine embodies the ideal of the scholar-emperor. His works on imperial administration, foreign relations, and court ceremony provide invaluable insights into the functioning of the medieval Byzantine state. To the Administrando Imperio, his handbook for governing the empire, reveals sophisticated understanding of international relations and strategic geography. The De Ceremoniis, his guide to court ritual, preserves details of imperial protocol that illuminate the empire's self-image and ideological foundations. Yet Constantine's scholarly achievements unfold against the backdrop of political powerlessness. For most of his long reign, actual authority rests with Romanos I Lekarpanos, an Armenian admiral who marries his daughter to the young emperor and rules as senior colleague. This arrangement, while humiliating for Constantine personally, proves beneficial for the empire. Romanos provides the military leadership and political cunning necessary to defend imperial frontiers, while Constantine pursues the cultural and intellectual activities that give the period its distinctive character. Under Romanos' leadership, the empire begins its military resurgence. The theme system, developed during the previous century's crisis, reaches full maturity as a defensive organization that provides both soldiers and agricultural workers for frontier regions. the fleet, rebuilt with new technologies and tactics, challenges Arab naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Most significantly, the empire begins limited offensive operations, probing Arab defenses and recovering territories lost during the 7th century's disasters. The culmination of this military revival comes during the reign of Nicephorus, the second Phocas, one of the greatest warrior emperors in Byzantine history. Rising to power in 963 through marriage to the Empress Theophano, Nicephorus brings to the throne decades of experience commanding frontier armies against Arab raiders. His physical appearance, scarred by countless battles and hardened by years of campaigning, embodies the martial spirit that drives the empire's expansion. Under Nicephorus's leadership, Byzantine armies achieved victories that seemed impossible during the empire's darkest hours. The island of Crete, lost to Arab corsairs in the 9th century, falls to imperial assault in 961. Cyprus follows in 965, bringing the empire's eastern naval defences to their strongest position in centuries. In Syria, Nicephorus's forces capture Antioch in 969, one of the great cities of early Christianity, recovering territory that had been under Arab rule for over 3 centuries. These victories resonate throughout the Christian world as signs of Byzantine resurgence. The empire that had seemed destined for extinction now appears capable of reversing centuries of territorial loss. Pilgrims and merchants flock to Constantinople, bringing wealth and knowledge that further stimulate the empire's cultural renaissance. The city's population swells to perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, making it once again one of the world's largest urban centers. Yet military success exacts its price in both blood and treasure. Nicephorus's harsh taxation policies, necessary to fund his costly campaigns, create widespread domestic unrest. His ascetic personal lifestyle, shaped by years of monastic influence, alienates court circles accustomed to imperial luxury. When a palace conspiracy led by his nephew John Zimisces results in his assassination in 969, few mourn the fallen emperor despite his remarkable achievements. John I, Zimisces, ascending through murder but ruling with remarkable effectiveness, continues and expands his predecessor's military policies. His campaigns push the empire's eastern frontier to the Euphrates River, while his intervention in Bulgarian affairs extends imperial influence deep into the Balkans. The sight of Byzantine standards planted on the walls of cities that had not seen Roman rule for centuries creates an intoxicating sense of restored greatness throughout the empire. Meanwhile, the cultural renaissance reaches new heights of sophistication. The Palatine Anthology preserves the literary achievements of court poets who create works rivaling the best of classical antiquity. Historical writing flourishes as chroniclers like Leo the Deacon record contemporary events with unprecedented detail and analytical sophistication. Theological scholarship produces synthetic works that reconcile competing traditions, while establishing orthodox doctrine on contested points. Perhaps most significantly for world history, this period witnesses the conversion of the Slavic peoples to Christianity under Byzantine auspices. The missions of Cyril and Methodius to the Moravians establish the precedent for Orthodox expansion into Eastern Europe. Their creation of the Cyrillic alphabet, based on Greek letters but adapted to Slavic sounds, provides the foundation for written culture among the Rus, Bulgarians, Serbs, and other peoples who will carry Byzantine traditions long after the empire's fall. The conversion of Vladimir I of Kiev in 988 represents the culmination of this Orthodox expansion. The marriage alliance between Vladimir and Anna Porphyrogenita, sister of the reigning emperor, brings the vast principality of Kiev into the Byzantine cultural sphere. The decision to adopt Orthodox rather than Latin Christianity shapes the religious and cultural development of Russia for centuries to come, extending Byzantine influence far beyond the empire's political frontiers. These achievements reached their zenith during the extraordinary reign of Basil II, who ascends the throne as a child in 976 but rules until 1025. As one of history's most successful emperors, the early years of his reign test the empire's stability as aristocratic. Families attempt to exploit the young emperor's weakness. The revolt of Bardas Skleros, and later that of Bardas Phocas, threatened to tear the empire apart in civil war. Only intervention by Vladimir's Varangian Guard, 6,000 Norse warriors sent to support the legitimate emperor, enables Basil to survive these challenges. Once secure on his throne, Basil reveals himself as a ruler of exceptional ability and ruthless determination. His systematic campaigns against the Bulgarian Empire, extending over nearly 2 decades, demonstrate strategic patience combined with tactical brilliance. The Bulgarians, who had established a powerful kingdom in the Balkans during the empire's weakness, find themselves gradually worn down by Basil's relentless pressure. The emperor's personal leadership in these campaigns becomes legendary. Unlike many of his predecessors who remained in the safety of Constantinople, Basil personally commands his armies in battle after battle. His stamina and endurance, legendary even among his hard-bitten soldiers, earn him their absolute devotion. His strategic vision, encompassing not just military operations but also the diplomatic and economic dimensions of warfare, proves superior to his opponent's more conventional approaches. The climax comes at the Battle of Cleidion in 1014, where Basil's forces destroy the main Bulgarian army and capture most of its soldiers. The emperor's treatment of these prisoners reveals the calculating cruelty that earns him the epithet Bulgar-Slayer. Of the 15,000 captured Bulgarians, 99 out of every 100 are blinded, with the 100th left with one eye to guide his companions home. When Tsar Samuel sees this ghastly procession returning to his capital, he suffers a stroke and dies, effectively ending Bulgarian resistance. Yet Basil's achievements extend beyond military conquest to encompass administrative reform and cultural patronage. His novel of 996, restricting the growth of aristocratic estates, protects the small farmers whose military service sustains the theme system. His careful attention to provincial administration ensures that newly conquered territories are integrated effectively into the imperial system. His court patronizes scholars and artists who create works that synthesize the achievements of the Macedonian Renaissance. The empire that Basil leaves at his death in 1025 represents the medieval peak of Byzantine power and prosperity. Stretching from southern Italy to the Euphrates River, from the Danube to Crete, it encompasses territories nearly as extensive as those ruled by Justinian. Its population, recovered from the devastating losses of earlier centuries, provides the tax revenues and military manpower necessary to sustain this vast domain. Its cultural achievements rival those of any contemporary civilization, while its military reputation ensures respect and fear among both enemies and allies. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the seeds of future challenges are already germinating. The Great Schism of 1054, though it occurs after Basil's death, reflects tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity that have been building throughout the Macedonian period. The growing power of the aristocratic families that Basil had struggled to contain will eventually overwhelm his successor's efforts at control. The demographic and economic pressures that had been held in check by military success will reassert themselves once expansion ceases. As you contemplate this remarkable Renaissance, picture the citizens of Constantinople during these golden decades. Merchants from Kiev and Cairo, Venice and Baghdad crowd the city's markets, bringing goods and ideas from across the known world. Scholars debate in the halls of the restored university, while artists create mosaics and manuscripts that will inspire admiration for centuries. The emperor processes through streets lined with cheering crowds, returning from another victory that extends the empire's frontiers and fills its treasuries. The purple-clad figure on his golden chariot embodies more than personal triumph. He represents the fulfillment of Byzantine dreams, the restoration of Roman greatness adapted to medieval circumstances. For nearly 2 centuries, the Macedonian dynasty has guided the empire from near extinction to unprecedented heights. Their legacy will outlive their line, providing inspiration and example for future generations who struggle to maintain what they have achieved against the relentless pressure of time and change. The bells of Hagia Sophia toll solemnly across Constantinople as Basil II's funeral procession winds through streets lined with mourning citizens. The emperor who had restored the empire to heights not seen since Justinian lies in state, his purple robes unable to conceal the warrior's scars that mark a lifetime of campaigning. As the great bronze doors of the church close behind his coffin, they seem to seal away an era. The Bulgar-Slayer has no sons, no designated heir whose proven competence might continue his policies. The throne passes to his elderly brother, Constantine the Eighth, a man more interested in court ceremonials than frontier campaigns. What follows reveals how quickly imperial fortunes can reverse when strong leadership gives way to weakness. Constantine the Eighth's brief reign introduces a fatal pattern: emperors chosen for their palace connections, rather than their administrative or military capabilities. His daughter Zoe, ascending the throne through marriage to Romanos III, Argyros, becomes the center of court intrigues that consume energy better spent on governance. When Romanos dies under suspicious circumstances, likely murdered on Zoe's orders, she marries her lover, Michael IV, beginning a carousel of imperial marriages and assassinations that makes stable policy impossible. The empire's military situation deteriorates as rapidly as its political stability. The theme system that had provided Basil II with reliable soldiers begins to break down as aristocratic families accumulate vast estates at the expense of the small farmers whose service had sustained imperial armies. Professional soldiers, many of them foreign mercenaries, replaced the citizen soldiers who had conquered Bulgaria and defended the frontiers for generations. These hired troops, while sometimes individually skilled, lack the commitment to imperial survival that had characterized earlier forces. On the empire's eastern frontier, a new enemy emerges from the steppes of Central Asia: the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam and inheritors of the Arab momentum that had been checked at Constantinople's walls, begin pressing into Armenia and eastern Anatolia. Unlike the Arabs, whose expansion had eventually stabilized into fixed frontiers, the Seljuks represent nomadic pressure that seeks not just conquest, but permanent settlement. Their horse, archers, mobile and elusive, prove ideally suited to the mountainous terrain of eastern Anatolia, where heavy Byzantine cavalry operates at disadvantage. The empire's response to this emerging threat reveals the extent of its institutional decay. Rather than mounting systematic campaigns to contain Seljuk expansion, successive emperors pursue ad hoc policies that often contradict each other. Diplomatic efforts to divide the Seljuks through alliances with rival claimants alternate with military expeditions that lack adequate preparation or strategic coordination. The frontier fortresses that had anchored Byzantine defense for centuries receive insufficient garrisons and supplies, making them vulnerable to siege and betrayal. Meanwhile, in the west, the empire faces another challenge that initially appears less threatening but ultimately proves equally dangerous. Norman adventurers, landless knights from northern France seeking fortune in foreign lands, established themselves in southern Italy during the 1040s and 1050s, led by figures like Robert Guiscard and his nephew Bohemond. These warriors possess military skills refined in the anarchic warfare of medieval France. Their heavy cavalry tactics, combined with innovative siege techniques, proved devastatingly effective against Byzantine forces trained to fight very different enemies. The Norman conquest of Byzantine Italy proceeds with methodical efficiency. One by one, the themed cities that had acknowledged imperial authority for centuries submit to Norman rule. Bari, the empire's administrative center in Italy, falls in 1071 after a siege that demonstrates both Norman military competence and Byzantine weakness. The loss severs the empire's connection to its Italian provinces, ending an association that stretched back to Justinian's reconquests 5 centuries earlier. The year 1071 becomes a watershed in Byzantine history, marked by 2 catastrophic defeats that shatter the empire's military prestige and strategic position. In Italy, the fall of Bari completes the Norman conquest of the peninsula, but the greater disaster unfolds on the empire's eastern frontier, where Emperor Romanos, the 4th Diogenes, leads the largest Byzantine army assembled in decades into the highlands of Armenia. Romanos IV represents a brief attempt to restore military competence to imperial leadership. A professional soldier who had risen through frontier service, he understands the Seljuk threat and commits substantial resources to containing it. His marriage to Eudokia Macrombolitissa, widow of the previous emperor, provides legitimacy while his military reputation offers hope for effective action. The campaign he launches in 1071 aims not merely to raid Seljuk territories but to secure the Armenian frontier through decisive victory. The Battle of Manzikert, fought on August 26, 1071, near the fortress town of that name in eastern Turkey, becomes one of history's most consequential military encounters. Sultan Alp Arslan, leading the Seljuk forces, initially seeks to avoid major battle, preferring to preserve his strength for campaigns against the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. But Romanos IV presses forward, seeking the decisive engagement that will restore Byzantine prestige and secure the eastern frontier. The battle's outcome hinges on a series of miscommunications and tactical errors that transform near victory into catastrophic defeat. As Byzantine forces advance across the plain before Manzikert, their formation becomes overextended and vulnerable to the Seljuk tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement. When rumors spread that the emperor has fallen, portions of the army begin withdrawing, creating gaps that Seljuk cavalry exploits with devastating effect. Romanos IV, fighting with desperate courage in the center, finds himself surrounded and captured as his army disintegrates around him. The psychological impact of Manzikert exceeds even its immediate military consequences. For the first time in centuries, a Byzantine emperor falls captive to enemy forces. The army that represented the empire's last hope for containing Seljuk expansion lies scattered across the Armenian highlands. The fortresses that guarded the eastern approaches to Constantinople stand exposed to attack with no field force capable of relieving them. Yet the disaster's full dimensions become clear only in its aftermath. Alp Arslan, perhaps recognizing that destroying the empire completely would remove a useful buffer against other enemies, treats his imperial captive with respect and releases him after negotiating a treaty that requires tribute payments but preserves Byzantine independence. The Sultan's moderation, however, proves irrelevant when Romanos IV returns to Constantinople to find his enemies have seized power in his absence. The civil war that follows Romanus's return completes the destruction that Manzikert had begun. Michael VII, Doukas, supported by powerful court factions, refuses to honor the treaty negotiated by his predecessor. The resulting political chaos paralyzes imperial responses to continuing Seljuk pressure while consuming resources needed for military reconstruction. Romanos IV, deposed and eventually blinded by his rivals, dies a broken man, his dreams of imperial restoration buried beneath the ambitions of those who prefer palace intrigue to frontier defense. During the decade following Manzikert's Seljuk forces overrun most of Anatolia with minimal resistance. The theme system, already weakened by aristocratic encroachment, collapses entirely as small farmers abandon their holdings to escape Turkish raiders. Ancient cities that had known Roman rule for over a millennium acknowledge new masters. Nicaea, less than 60 miles from Constantinople itself, becomes the capital of a Seljuk Sultanate that controls territory within sight of the imperial capital. By 1081, when Alexios I Komnenos seizes power through military coup, the empire has contracted to Constantinople, scattered coastal enclaves, and portions of the Balkans where other enemies press their own advantages. The new emperor, though descended from military aristocracy and personally capable, inherits a situation that appears hopeless. The treasury stands empty, the army has virtually ceased to exist, and enemies threaten from every direction. Alexius's early reign demonstrates both the depths of imperial weakness and the persistence of Byzantine resilience. When Robert Guiscard lands in the Balkans with a Norman army intent on conquering Constantinople itself, the emperor can field only a few thousand troops to oppose an invasion force that threatens the empire's very existence. The Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081 results in crushing defeat for Byzantine forces, opening the road to the capital for Norman armies. Yet Alexios proves himself a master of the diplomatic and political arts that complement military action. Through a combination of Venetian naval support, Bulgarian alliances, and exploitation of Norman succession disputes, he gradually contains and eventually repels Guiscard's invasion. The death of the Norman leader in 1085 ends the immediate threat to Constantinople, but leaves the empire's fundamental weaknesses unresolved. The First Crusade, that results from Urban's proclamation, represents both the salvation and the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. The massive armies that gather in Constantinople during 1096 and 1097 provide the military strength necessary to reclaim much of Anatolia from Seljuk control. Yet these same forces introduce tensions between East and West that will ultimately prove more destructive than any external enemy. Faced with enemies on every frontier and resources insufficient for effective defense, Alexios adopts a strategy that will have consequences extending far beyond his reign. In 1095, he sends ambassadors to Pope Urban II requesting military assistance against the Seljuk Turks. His appeal emphasizes the plight of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule and the threat to pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land, arguments calculated to resonate with Western religious sentiment. The imperial request envisions limited military assistance, perhaps a few thousand professional soldiers, who would serve under Byzantine command to recover key fortresses in Anatolia. What Alexios receives instead transforms the medieval world in ways he never anticipated. Pope Urban II, addressing the Council of Clermont in November 1095, proclaims a holy war to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. His call for crusade ignites religious enthusiasm throughout Western Europe, mobilizing forces far beyond anything the Byzantine Emperor had imagined possible. The cultural and religious differences between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies become apparent from their first encounters. The Western knights, accustomed to the feudal practices of medieval Europe, find Byzantine court ceremonials alien and effeminate. Their straightforward approach to warfare conflicts with Byzantine preferences for diplomacy and strategic patience. Most significantly, their religious enthusiasm, while admirable in its sincerity, lacks the theological sophistication that characterizes Eastern Christianity. When Godfrey of Bouillon leads the first major Crusader contingent to Constantinople, the ceremony in which he swears allegiance to Alexios reveals these underlying tensions. The Western Duke performs the required oath with visible reluctance, while his followers make clear their suspicion of Byzantine motives. Similar scenes repeat as other Crusader leaders arrive, each interaction deepening mutual mistrust between supposed allies. Despite these diplomatic difficulties, the military cooperation between Byzantines and Crusaders achieves remarkable success. The siege of Nicaea in 1097 returns this crucial city to imperial control through combined operations that demonstrate what East and West might accomplish together. The subsequent Crusader victory at Dorylaeum opens central Anatolia to reconquest, while Byzantine forces systematically reoccupy coastal cities that provide secure bases for further operations. Yet the partnership begins dissolving even as it achieves its greatest successes. When Bohemond establishes the Principality of Antioch in 1098, he refuses to honor his oath to return the city to Byzantine control. His retention of this crucial stronghold, despite explicit agreements to the contrary, sets a precedent that other Crusader leaders follow. Jerusalem's conquest in 1099 creates additional Crusader states that acknowledge no Byzantine authority, despite their location in territories the empire claims as rightfully its own. The establishment of the Crusader states marks the beginning of a fundamental shift in Byzantine relations with the West. What had begun as a request for military assistance becomes a permanent Western presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader kingdoms, while officially Christian and theoretically aligned with Byzantine interests, pursue independent policies that often conflict with imperial objectives. Their military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, develop into autonomous powers that owe allegiance to no Eastern authority, more troubling for long-term Byzantine interests. The Crusader presence introduces direct competition for influence over trade routes that have sustained imperial prosperity for centuries. Italian merchants, particularly the Venetians, used their support for Crusader states to secure commercial privileges that undermine Byzantine economic independence. The Chrysobull of 1082, granting Venetian merchants extensive trading rights throughout the empire, represents an early example of how military necessity forces concessions that weaken imperial sovereignty. The commercial revolution that transforms the medieval Mediterranean during the 11th and 12th centuries poses challenges that prove ultimately more dangerous than military threats. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa developed naval and commercial capabilities that rival and eventually surpass Byzantine achievements. Their merchants, protected by their government's military power, established trading networks that gradually displace Byzantine intermediaries from profitable markets. The empire's response to these commercial challenges reveals the extent to which military weakness has undermined its negotiating position. Unable to exclude Western merchants by force, successive emperors attempt to play Italian cities against each other through competing grants of trade privileges. This strategy provides temporary relief, but ultimately accelerates the empire's commercial subordination, as each new concession reduces imperial control over its own economy. By the mid-12th century, the transformation of Crusader enthusiasm into Western imperial ambition becomes increasingly apparent. The Second Crusade, launched in response to Muslim reconquest of Crusader territory, demonstrates the extent to which Western leaders now view the East as a legitimate sphere for their own expansion. When Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France lead their armies through Byzantine territory, they negotiate not as supplicants seeking assistance, but as equals pursuing their own strategic objectives. The reign of Manuel I Comnenos, spanning the crucial decades from 1143 to 1180, represents the empire's last serious attempt to restore its position through active partnership with the West. Manuel's marriage to Bertha of Solzbach, his alliance with Conrad III, and his intervention in Italian politics all reflect a strategy of integration that might have preserved Byzantine independence through willing cooperation with Western powers. Yet, Manuel's policies also reveal how Western pressure has forced the empire to abandon its traditional advantages. His costly campaigns in Italy drain resources better used for Anatolian defense. His diplomatic initiatives require concessions to Western, religious, and commercial demands that gradually erode imperial autonomy. Most fatally, his defeat at Myriokelen in 1176, where Seljuk forces destroy a massive Byzantine army, demonstrates that even the most capable Comnenian emperor cannot simultaneously meet Eastern and Western challenges. As you contemplate this gradual transformation of Crusader allies into imperial rivals, picture the empire's leaders struggling to navigate between competing pressures that offer no satisfactory resolution. Each concession to Western demands creates precedents that justify further interference. Each attempt to assert traditional imperial prerogatives provokes Western hostility that the empire can no longer afford. The empire that had once commanded respect from enemies and allies alike finds itself increasingly dependent on the very forces that threaten its independence. The stage is set for the catastrophe that will shatter the empire more completely than any external invasion. Venice, enriched by its privileged position in Byzantine trade and emboldened by the empire's apparent weakness, prepares to transform the Fourth Crusade from a war of liberation into an enterprise of conquest. The ships that gather in Venetian harbours carry not only Western knights seeking glory in the Holy Land, but also the instruments of imperial destruction that will reduce Constantinople to a Latin colony. The Venetian ships that had gathered in the lagoon through the summer of 1203 finally spread their sails and catch the autumn winds, carrying not liberation to the Holy Land, but devastation toward the Queen of Cities herself. Aboard these vessels, Western knights who had taken the cross to fight Muslims find themselves instead approaching the greatest Christian city in the world. The transformation of the Fourth Crusade from holy war to commercial venture represents one of history's most cynical betrayals. Yet it unfolds with an inevitability that reveals how completely the relationship between East and West has deteriorated. Doge Enrico Dandolo, though nearly blind and well into his 80s, possesses a strategic vision that extends far beyond the immediate profits of transporting crusaders. Venice's maritime empire requires the elimination of Byzantine competition in Mediterranean trade, and the Fourth Crusade provides the perfect instrument for achieving this goal. When the Crusader leadership proves unable to pay the full cost of transport as originally agreed, Dandolo offers alternative arrangements that gradually bind them to Venetian objectives. The diversion to Zara in November 1203 establishes the precedent for what follows. This prosperous Dalmatian city, though Christian and under Hungarian protection, competes with Venetian commercial interests in the Adriatic when Dandolo persuades the Crusaders to capture Zara as partial payment for their passage. He demonstrates how easily religious enthusiasm can be manipulated to serve secular ambitions. Pope Innocent III's excommunication of the entire expedition for attacking fellow Christians proves ineffective against forces already committed to a course that promises worldly rewards. The arrival of Alexios IV Angelos in the Crusader camp provides Dandolo with the final justification needed for attacking Constantinople directly. This young Byzantine prince, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, Angelos offers extravagant promises in exchange for Western support in reclaiming his father's throne. He pledges 200,000 silver marks, provisions for the Crusader army, military assistance for their campaign in the Holy Land, and most significantly, the submission of the Orthodox Church to papal authority. These promises, impossible to fulfill even if offered in good faith, appeal to different factions within the Crusader leadership for different reasons. The Venetians see opportunity for commercial dominance. The French nobles envision territorial gains in a rich land. The clergy imagine the reunion of Christendom under Roman authority. Each group finds in Alexius's proposals what they most desire, creating a coalition united by greed despite fundamental differences in motivation. The first assault on Constantinople in July 1203 reveals both the city's continuing strength and its fatal vulnerabilities. The massive walls that have protected the capital for 8 centuries still present a formidable barrier to direct attack. The chain across the Golden Horn continues to guard the harbour from naval assault. Yet the empire's military weakness, accumulated through decades of civil war and misgovernment, proves decisive when tested by determined enemies. Emperor Alexios III Angelos, learning of the approaching Crusader fleet, flees Constantinople under cover of darkness rather than organizing the city's defense. His abandonment of the throne creates the very power vacuum that the Crusaders have come to exploit. Isaac II, restored to power alongside his son Alexios IV, inherits a treasury emptied by his predecessors' misrule and subjects resentful of the foreign presence that has forced this unwelcome restoration. The young co-emperor's attempts to fulfill his promises to the Crusaders reveal the impossibility of his position. The 200,000 silver marks he had pledged exceed the empire's entire annual revenue. The submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome encounters fanatical resistance from clergy and people alike. His efforts to collect additional taxes provoke popular uprisings that threaten to tear the capital apart even before the Crusaders resume their assault. The revolution that sweeps Alexios IV from power in January 1204 brings to the throne Alexios V Doukas, who represents the empire's last desperate attempt to resist Western domination. Unlike his predecessors, who had sought accommodation with the Crusaders, this new emperor explicitly rejects all agreements with the invaders and begins preparing Constantinople for siege. His defiance, while admirable in its patriotism, comes too late to reverse the damage that previous rulers' weakness has inflicted. The siege that begins in April 1204 pits the accumulated military expertise of Western Europe against defences that had protected Constantinople for nearly 9 centuries. The Crusaders' assault, combining Venetian naval power with French siegecraft, demonstrates tactical innovations that overcome traditional Byzantine advantages. The use of covered galleries to approach the seawall, the construction of massive catapults to breach the fortifications, and most decisively, the employment of Venetian galleys as floating siege towers represent military engineering superior to anything the defenders can counter. Yet the city's fall results as much from internal collapse as external assault. The fires that rage through Constantinople's commercial districts during the siege destroy vast quantities of the wealth that might have funded continued resistance. The flight of many aristocratic families to their country estates deprives the defense of crucial leadership. Most significantly, the popular hatred for the Latin presence that had brought about Alexios IV's overthrow now paralyzes effective organization of resistance against the very forces that popular sentiment opposes. The final assault of April 13th, 1204, succeeds through a combination of tactical brilliance and fortunate accident. When Venetian galleys managed to establish footholds on the seawall through coordinated assault, they create breaches that French knights exploit with devastating effectiveness. The sight of Western banners flying from the walls that had never before fallen to foreign conquest breaks the defenders' morale and triggers the general collapse that ends 11 centuries of unbroken Roman rule in the Queen of Cities. What follows represents one of history's most systematic destructions of urban civilization. For 3 days, Western knights and Venetian sailors loot Constantinople with methodical thoroughness that reveals long preparation for this opportunity. The imperial palace, accumulated treasures of a dozen centuries, suffers complete pillaging. Churches lose their sacred vessels, relics, and artistic treasures to men who claim to fight for Christendom while destroying its greatest monuments. The Hagia Sophia, greatest church in the Eastern world, becomes the symbol of this cultural catastrophe. Crusaders stabled their horses in the nave where emperors had been crowned for 7 centuries. They stripped the silver from the iconoclasts and melt down golden liturgical vessels to satisfy their greed for precious metal. Most shockingly, they install a prostitute on the patriarchal throne to mock the religious traditions they profess to honor. These acts of sacrilege horrify even Western chroniclers, yet they continue for days without effective leadership intervention. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople represents the culmination of this conquest, yet also reveals its fundamental weaknesses. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned as the first Latin emperor in Hagia Sophia, rules over a domain whose territorial extent exists largely on paper, beyond Constantinople itself and scattered coastal strongholds. The empire controls little territory and commands minimal popular loyalty. The partition treaty that divides Byzantine territories among Western leaders creates a patchwork of competing jurisdictions that proves impossible to govern effectively. Venice emerges as the true victor of this enterprise, securing the commercial dominance that George Dunderlow had sought from the beginning. The Venetian quarter of Constantinople becomes virtually autonomous, while Venetian fleets gain control of crucial harbours throughout the former empire. The plunder carried back to Venice, including the famous bronze horses that still adorn St. Mark's Cathedral, represents only the most visible portion of wealth that flows westward from the destruction of Byzantine civilization. Yet the Latin conquest's very success contains the seeds of its eventual failure. The Orthodox population, from patriarchs to peasants, refuses to accept Western rule as legitimate, regardless of its military effectiveness. The ceremony that crowns Baldwin in Hagia Sophia appears to his subjects not as the foundation of legitimate authority, but as the desecration of sacred space by foreign heretics. This fundamental rejection of Latin legitimacy ensures that resistance continues even when organized military opposition collapses. 3 separate Byzantine governments emerge from the wreckage of the empire, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of Roman authority. In Asia Minor, Theodore I Lascaris establishes the Empire of Nicaea, with support from refugees who have fled the Latin conquest. His marriage to Anna Komnenos, daughter of Alexios III, provides dynastic legitimacy, while his control of important Anatolian cities offers the territorial base necessary for effective government. Simultaneously, Alexios I Komnenos establishes the Empire of Trebizond on the southeastern shore of the Black Sea. This state, though smaller than Nicaea, possesses considerable wealth derived from trade routes connecting Europe with Asia. Its strategic position enables diplomatic relationships with both Christian and Muslim neighbors that ensure its survival despite limited military resources. The third successor state emerges in Epirus under Michael I Komnenos Doukas, who creates a despotate that controls much of western Greece and Albania. Though territorially the smallest of the three Byzantine successor states, Epirus enjoys the advantage of proximity to Latin territories, enabling military pressure that constrains Western consolidation of power in the Balkans. The competition among these three claimants to Byzantine legitimacy initially weakens resistance to Latin rule, as each focuses more on establishing supremacy over its orthodox rivals than on coordinating opposition to the Western conquest. Yet this division also ensures that Latin forces cannot concentrate against any single target, preventing the complete elimination of Byzantine political structures that might otherwise have been achieved. Theodore I Lascaris emerges as the most effective of these successor rulers, combining military competence with diplomatic skill that enables Nicaea's gradual expansion. His alliance with the Bulgarian Tsar Kaloyan creates pressure on Latin forces from multiple directions, while his negotiations with Muslim neighbors secure the empire's Anatolian frontiers against Turkish expansion. Most importantly, his establishment of an Orthodox Patriarchate in Nicaea provides religious legitimacy that contrasts sharply with the Latin occupation of Constantinople. The death of Emperor Baldwin in Bulgarian captivity after just 1 year of rule reveals the Latin Empire's military weakness and strategic vulnerability. His successor, Henry of Flanders, proves a more capable ruler, but inherits problems that competent leadership alone cannot resolve. The constant warfare necessary to maintain Latin control drains resources while failing to establish the security that might enable economic recovery. The recruitment of adequate military forces becomes increasingly difficult as Western enthusiasm for Eastern ventures diminishes. By the 1220s, the balance of power has shifted decisively in favor of the Byzantine successor states. John III Darchus Vatatzes, assuming power in Nicaea in 1221, combines his predecessor's diplomatic skill with greater military aggression and more systematic administrative reforms. His campaigns gradually recover Anatolian territories, while his interventions in European politics exploit Latin weaknesses with increasing effectiveness. The recapture of Thessalonica by the despotate of Epirus in 1224 represents a major symbolic victory for Orthodox resistance, returning the empire's second city to Byzantine control after 2 decades of Latin rule. Though this success strengthens Epirus rather than Nicaea, it demonstrates Latin inability to maintain control over territories beyond their immediate military reach. Meanwhile, the internal politics of the Latin Empire deteriorate as competing Western factions pursue conflicting objectives that undermine unified resistance to Byzantine pressure. The rivalry between French nobles and Venetian merchants creates administrative chaos that efficient Byzantine administration exploits. The succession disputes that follow Henry's death in 1216 further weaken Latin authority while providing opportunities for Byzantine diplomatic intervention. Michael VIII, ascending to power in Nicaea in 1261 through a combination of marriage alliance and military coup, inherits a state positioned to achieve what had seemed impossible just decades earlier: the restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople. His careful diplomacy isolates the Latin Empire from potential Western support, while his military preparations ensure sufficient force to overcome the depleted garrison that still holds the Queen of Cities. The reconquest of Constantinople on July 25, 1261, unfolds with surprising ease that reflects how completely Latin power has collapsed. Michael's general, Alexios Strategopoulos, exploits the absence of the Latin Emperor Baldwin II and his Venetian allies to infiltrate the city with a small force that opens the gates for the main Byzantine army. The sight of imperial banners once again flying from the walls that Constantine had built triggers popular celebrations that confirm the Latin Empire's complete loss of legitimacy. Yet, the empire that Michael VIII restores bears little resemblance to the state that Alexios IV had lost 60 years earlier. The territories under effective imperial control barely extend beyond Constantinople and scattered enclaves in Asia Minor and Thrace. The treasury stands empty, drained by decades of warfare and the enormous costs of maintaining government in exile. Most devastatingly, the empire's commercial supremacy has passed permanently to Venice and its Italian rivals, leaving the restored state financially dependent on the very powers that had engineered its destruction. The coronation ceremony that formally restores Michael as Byzantine emperor in Hagia Sophia represents both triumph and tragedy. The church, where Latin emperors had ruled for 6 decades, once again echoes with Orthodox liturgy and imperial ceremonial. Yet the building itself bears scars of its occupation. While many of its greatest treasures remain scattered in Western collections, the empire has returned home, but home itself has been irreversibly transformed. As you contemplate this catastrophic period in Byzantine history, picture the horror of Orthodox believers watching foreign soldiers desecrate their holiest spaces while claiming to serve Christ. Imagine the despair of scholars witnessing the destruction of libraries that contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Consider the resilience of the Byzantine people who, despite military defeat and cultural humiliation, preserve their identity through decades of exile and gradually rebuild institutions that enable their eventual return. The Fourth Crusade represents more than a military defeat or political catastrophe. It marks the moment when the Christian unity that had once united East and West dissolves into irreconcilable antagonism. The empire that returns to Constantinople in 1261 can never again trust Western promises or rely on Western support. The seeds of final destruction planted during these years of Latin rule will eventually grow into the Ottoman conquest that ends Byzantine history forever. The golden dome of Hagia Sophia gleams once more beneath Orthodox crosses as Michael VIII Palaiologos processes through streets that echo with Byzantine hymns for the first time in 60 years. Yet even as the restored emperor kneels before the high altar where his predecessors had been crowned for 8 centuries, the harsh realities of the empire's diminished state intrude upon this moment of triumph. The territories that acknowledge his authority represent barely a fraction of what the Komnenoi had ruled 2 centuries earlier. The treasury that must fund imperial ambitions contains little more than the silver coins needed for the coronation ceremony itself. The empire that Michael has restored exists in a fundamentally different world from the one that fell to Latin conquest. Venice has used the decades of Byzantine exile to establish commercial networks that no longer require Constantinople's participation. Genoa competes with Venice for Eastern trade while treating the restored empire as a minor partner rather than a dominant power. Most ominously, new Muslim states have filled the power vacuum created by Byzantine weakness, establishing themselves so firmly in Anatolian territories that their displacement would require military resources the empire no longer possesses. Michael's first challenge comes not from these distant threats, but from immediate Western hostility to his restoration. Charles of Anjou, brother of the French king and ruler of Sicily, assembles a formidable coalition dedicated to restoring Latin rule in Constantinople. His alliance with the exiled Latin emperor Baldwin II, the Venetians, who had profited from Byzantine subordination, and disaffected Orthodox nobles who had collaborated with the Latin regime, creates the most serious threat the restored empire faces. The diplomatic genius that Michael displays in neutralizing this coalition reveals both the possibilities and limitations of Byzantine statecraft in its final centuries. Unable to match Angevin military power directly, he employs the empire's remaining assets with brilliant effectiveness. Gold, carefully husbanded from the empire's diminished revenues, finances rebellions in Sicily that distract Charles from eastern ambitions. Intelligence networks, rebuilt from the connections Orthodox merchants maintain throughout the Mediterranean, provide advance warning of Western military preparations. Most controversially, Michael pursues church union with Rome as a diplomatic weapon against his Catholic enemies. His participation in the Council of Lyons in 1274, where he formally acknowledges papal supremacy in exchange for protection against Charles of Anjou, represents pragmatic calculation rather than genuine religious conviction. The agreement provides temporary security for the empire, while requiring no substantial changes to Orthodox practice, since Michael carefully avoids implementing union in ways that would trigger popular resistance. Yet this diplomatic success comes at enormous cost to imperial legitimacy. The Orthodox population, from monastery to marketplace, rejects any accommodation with the Latin Church that had presided over Constantinople's humiliation. Michael's sister, Eulogia, speaking for countless Orthodox believers, declares she would rather see the empire ruled by Muslims than submit to papal authority. This popular opposition forces the emperor to pursue union secretly while maintaining Orthodox practices publicly, creating internal contradictions that weaken imperial authority. The Sicilian Vespers of 1282, the popular uprising that destroys Angevin power in Sicily, represents the ultimate vindication of Michael's strategy, yet also reveals its moral ambiguity. Byzantine gold and diplomatic encouragement help trigger the rebellion that eliminates the most serious threat to the restored empire's survival. Yet the thousands of French settlers massacred during the uprising die partly due to policies pursued by an emperor who claims to represent Christian values. Michael's death in 1282 brings to the throne his son Andronikos II, who inherits an empire that has survived its most immediate crises but faces long-term challenges that prove even more intractable. The new emperor, scholarly and pious but lacking his father's political cunning, attempts to restore imperial finances through policies that ultimately accelerate the empire's decline. His disbanding of the imperial navy to reduce costs eliminates Byzantine naval power just as Turkish pirates begin threatening the empire's remaining coastal territories. The emperor's monetary policies reveal the depth of the empire's economic crisis. The gold solidus, symbol of Byzantine financial stability for 7 centuries, disappears from circulation as the imperial mints lack sufficient precious metal for coinage. The hyperpyron, its replacement, undergoes repeated debasements that destroy confidence in imperial currency while failing to generate adequate revenue for governmental functions. By the early 14th century, foreign coins dominate commercial transactions even within Constantinople itself. More devastating than these financial problems the empire faces the rise of the Ottoman Beylik in northwestern Anatolia. Osman I, founding leader of what will become the Ottoman dynasty, exploits Byzantine weakness to expand his territory at imperial expense. His successors, Orhan and Murad I, transform a minor Turkish principality into the dominant power in Anatolia and the Balkans through a combination of military innovation, administrative efficiency, and strategic vision that surpasses anything the declining empire can muster. The civil war that erupts between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III, beginning in 1321, reveals how completely the empire has lost control over its internal politics. What begins as a family dispute over imperial policy escalates into a devastating conflict that divides the empire's remaining territories between competing claimants. The younger Andronikos, supported by ambitious nobles seeking advancement through dynastic change, proves militarily superior to his grandfather despite controlling fewer resources. This civil war provides the Ottomans with their first major opportunity for European expansion. Both sides in the Byzantine conflict employ Turkish mercenaries, introducing Ottoman forces to the empire's European territories and revealing their military weakness to potential conquerors. When Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, establishes the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe at Gallipoli in 1354, he exploits knowledge gained during these mercenary campaigns to select a strategic position that enables subsequent expansion. The death of Andronikos III in 1341 triggers an even more devastating civil war that completes the empire's transformation from independent state to Ottoman dependency. John V, Palaeologos, ascending the throne as a child, cannot prevent John VI Kantakouzenos from claiming imperial authority through a combination of aristocratic support and Ottoman military assistance. The resulting conflict, lasting until 1347, devastates the empire's remaining territories while establishing precedents for Turkish intervention in Byzantine affairs. Kantakouzenos' reliance on Ottoman support reveals the empire's complete loss of military independence. His marriage of his daughter Theodora to Orhan formalizes the subordinate relationship that military necessity has created. When he formally abdicates in 1354, retiring to monastic life while writing historical works that document the empire's decline, he leaves behind a state that exists only through Turkish tolerance and suffers Turkish occupation of strategic territories. The Black Death, reaching Constantinople in 1347, compounds these political disasters with demographic catastrophe that eliminates perhaps 1/3 of the empire's already diminished population. The plague's impact on the empire proves particularly severe because of the disruption caused by civil war and the inability of weakened governmental institutions to organize effective responses. Villages throughout the empire's remaining territories are abandoned as their populations flee or perish, leaving vast areas effectively depopulated. Yet amid this general collapse, the empire experiences a remarkable spiritual renaissance that provides meaning and hope to Orthodox believers struggling with material decline. The Hesychast movement, emphasizing mystical prayer and direct experience of divine light, spreads from Mount Athos throughout the Orthodox world. Gregory Palamas, the movement's leading theologian, develops sophisticated arguments defending Hesychast practices against Western scholastic criticism while affirming Orthodox theological independence from Latin influence. This religious revival, while providing spiritual comfort, also deepens the theological divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. The triumph of Palamite theology, officially endorsed by the Synod of Constantinople in 1351, establishes doctrinal positions that make church union even more difficult to achieve. The empire's increasing religious isolation compounds its political and military weakness, while reducing options for securing Western assistance against Ottoman expansion. John V's reign, spanning the crucial decades from 1354 to 1391, witnesses the empire's final transformation from independent state to Ottoman vassal. His desperate journey to Rome in 1369, where he personally converts to Catholicism in hope of securing papal support, demonstrates the extremity of imperial circumstances while achieving no practical benefit. His son Manuel accompanies Ottoman forces in their Anatolian campaigns, serving Turkish interests against his own imperial dignity to preserve his inheritance. The Ottoman victory at Kosovo in 1389, eliminating the last significant Balkan resistance to Turkish expansion, reduces the empire to Constantinople and scattered islands whose survival depends entirely on Ottoman forbearance. Sultan Bayezid I, inheriting this dominant position, treats Byzantine emperors as servants rather than allies, while gradually tightening restrictions on their remaining autonomy. The siege of Constantinople that Bayezid begins in 1394 appears certain to end the empire's 1,000-year survival, until extraordinary circumstances provide unexpected deliverance. Timur's invasion of Anatolia and devastating defeat of Ottoman forces at Ankara in 1402 creates an Ottoman succession crisis that provides the empire with its final century of existence. John VII and Manuel II, the Byzantine emperors who witness this sudden reversal of fortune, understand that they have received not permanent salvation but temporary reprieve. Manuel II's reign, extending through the early 15th century, represents the empire's last period of relative stability and cultural achievement. His diplomatic missions to Western courts, including his famous visit to London and Paris, demonstrate remarkable personal dignity while achieving minimal practical results. His philosophical and theological writings reveal an intellect worthy of the empire's greatest traditions, yet one applied to problems that no amount of wisdom can resolve. The restoration of Ottoman power under Mehmed I and Murad II gradually eliminates the breathing space that Timur's victory had provided. The Ottoman recapture of Thessalonica in 1430 returns the empire's second city to Turkish control after a Venetian interlude that had offered false hope for Western protection. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople's remaining suburbs during the 1440s demonstrates that the final siege is merely a matter of timing rather than possibility. John VIII's desperate pursuit of church union at the Council of Florence in 1439 represents the empire's final attempt to secure Western military assistance through religious concessions. The emperor's acceptance of papal supremacy and Latin theological positions creates a formal agreement that appears to offer hope for Crusader intervention. Yet the popular Orthodox rejection of union, led by figures like Mark Eugenikos, who declare they would prefer Turkish rule to Latin heresy, ensures that any Western assistance would require the empire's spiritual suicide. The Council's failure to generate significant Western military support reveals how completely the balance of power has shifted since the early Crusades. European attention focuses on Italian wars, French-English conflicts, and domestic challenges that make Eastern interventions seem remote and optional. The few Western volunteers who eventually participate in Constantinople's defense represent individual heroism rather than coordinated state policy. Constantine the Eleventh Palaiologos, ascending the throne in 1449, inherits an empire reduced to Constantinople itself and a few Aegean islands whose combined population barely exceeds that of a modest medieval city. His desperate diplomatic missions seeking Western support encounter polite expressions of sympathy, but no substantial commitment to imperial survival. The arrival of Mehmed II on the Ottoman throne in 1451, bringing youthful energy and unlimited ambition to the question of Constantinople's conquest, eliminates even the hope that Turkish forbearance might extend the empire's existence indefinitely. The final years before the siege witness the empire's preparation for an ending that everyone understands as inevitable. The small garrison that Constantine assembles, combining loyal Greeks with Genoese volunteers and a handful of other Westerners, possesses courage that no rational calculation would justify. The diplomatic appeals to Western courts continue until the final weeks, even as Ottoman siege preparations make clear that no relief force could arrive in time to matter. The religious debates over church union continue in Hagia Sophia even as Ottoman canons position themselves beyond the ancient walls. The emperor's public participation in Latin liturgy alienates many of his subjects, while failing to generate the Western support that might have justified this spiritual compromise. The sight of Orthodox and Catholic priests celebrating joint services in the great cathedral that had witnessed 8 centuries of imperial coronations creates scenes, both inspiring and tragic in their futility. As 1452 draws to a close and reports arrive of massive Ottoman military preparations across the Bosphorus, the empire's final chapter approaches its conclusion. The city that Constantine the Great had founded as a new Rome prepares to face its ultimate test under Constantine the Eleventh, a descendant who bears the founder's name, while possessing none of the resources that had made the original achievement possible. The stage is set for the final act of the world's longest-lived political institution. The empire that had survived Goths and Huns, Arabs and Bulgars, Normans and Crusaders, internal rebellions and external invasions, plague and famine, theological controversies and dynastic disputes, now faces an enemy whose military capabilities exceed anything it has previously confronted, while possessing resources diminished to their absolute minimum. As you drift toward contemplation of these final decades, picture the last emperors walking through halls where their predecessors had ruled territories spanning 3 continents. The purple robes that Constantine the Eleventh wears carry the weight of 13 centuries of Roman history, yet cover shoulders that bear responsibility for protecting fewer subjects than a provincial governor had once commanded. The empire's end approaches, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow exhaustion of all possibilities for survival, save the kind of miracle that even the most faithful understand occurs rarely in human history. The winter of 1452 passes with ominous quiet in Constantinople, as citizens go about their daily routines, while knowing that each sunrise might be among their last in a free city. Across the Bosphorus, the sound of hammering echoes day and night as Ottoman engineers construct the massive fortress of Rumeli Hisari, designed to control all shipping to the capital and complete the stranglehold that will make the coming siege inevitable. Constantine the Eleventh stands often upon the palace walls, watching this construction with the resignation of a man who understands that his fate was sealed the moment Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne. The young sultan, who has inherited the most powerful empire in the Near East, possesses an ambition that his predecessors had tempered with pragmatic caution. Where earlier Ottoman rulers had been content to extract tribute from the dying Byzantine state while pursuing conquests elsewhere, Mehmed burns with a singular obsession. He will be remembered as the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who finally extinguished the last ember of Roman power that has flickered for over 1,000 years since the Western Empire's fall. At just 21 years of age, Mehmed combines youthful energy with sophisticated understanding of both military technology and psychological warfare. His court includes Hungarian engineers who design artillery pieces larger than any previously constructed, Italian experts in siegecraft who understand the latest developments in fortress reduction, and former Byzantine officials whose knowledge of the city's defenses proves invaluable for planning the assault. This cosmopolitan gathering of talent reflects the Ottoman Empire's ability to attract the best minds of the age, regardless of their religious or ethnic origins. The diplomatic preparations for siege proceed with methodical precision throughout the spring of 1453. Mehmed's ambassadors secure neutrality agreements with Venice and Genoa, ensuring that no significant Western naval intervention will disrupt his plans. His treaties with Wallachia and Serbia provide the additional troops necessary for a complete blockade, while his arrangements with Hungarian merchants ensure adequate supplies for the massive army he plans to deploy. Every potential source of external assistance for the defenders receives Ottoman attention, designed to eliminate or neutralize their capacity for intervention. Meanwhile, Constantine the Eleventh pursues his own desperate preparations with resources so limited that his efforts appear almost pathetic beside Ottoman abundance. His total garrison numbers fewer than 7,000 men, including civilians pressed into service for the emergency. His artillery consists of a handful of outdated cannons whose effectiveness pales beside the massive guns Mehmed is preparing to deploy. Most crucially, his treasury contains barely enough gold to maintain this minimal force through a siege whose duration no one can predict. Yet the emperor's greatest challenge lies not in these material shortages, but in maintaining unity among his diverse and demoralized population. The religious controversy over church union continues to divide Orthodox believers, with many preferring Turkish conquest to submission to papal authority. The Genoese residents of Galata, officially neutral but suspected of Ottoman sympathies, control the northern shore of the Golden Horn and could potentially assist the attackers. Even among the Greek population, some wonder whether Ottoman rule might prove preferable to the grinding poverty and constant uncertainty that characterize the empire's final years. The emperor's personal response to these challenges reveals both his strengths and the tragic limitations of his position. His courage never wavers, despite circumstances that would crush lesser men. His commitment to his people's welfare leads him to share their dangers rather than seeking safety in flight. As several advisors recommend, his diplomatic skills maintain the fragile coalition that holds the city's defenses together despite fundamental disagreements about strategy and objectives. Yet, for all his personal virtues, Constantine possesses neither the resources nor the time necessary to address the empire's fundamental weaknesses. The siege begins in earnest on April 6, 1453, when advance Ottoman forces establish camps beyond the landward walls while the main army completes its approach to the city. The sight that greets Constantinople's defenders from their ancient ramparts defies their worst expectations. Mehmed's host numbers over 100,000 men, including elite Janissary units, whose discipline and equipment surpass anything the empire can deploy. Artillery trains carry cannons of unprecedented size, including the massive gun cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban that requires 60 oxen to move and creates craters 30 feet across when fired. The contrast between besiegers and besieged becomes starkly apparent as Ottoman forces establish their siege lines with professional efficiency. Mehmed's engineers survey the walls with mathematical precision, identifying weak points and calculating angles of fire with scientific methodology. His logistics corps establishes supply lines that can maintain this enormous force indefinitely, while his naval commanders position fleets to complete the city's isolation from the sea. The Ottomans approach siege warfare as applied engineering, bringing systematic methodology to what had traditionally been crude tests of endurance. Constantine's response demonstrates both the defenders' determination and their desperate improvisation. His engineers, led by the Scottish soldier John Grant, strengthen the walls with earthworks and wooden palisades designed to absorb artillery impact. His sailors stretch a great chain across the Golden Horn, hoping to prevent Ottoman ships from entering the harbour and attacking the less fortified seawall. Most importantly, his diplomats continue negotiating with Mehmed until the final moment, offering increased tribute and territorial concessions that might preserve some vestige of imperial independence. These final negotiations reveal the unbridgeable gap between Ottoman ambitions and Byzantine hopes. Mehmed's demands include not merely submission, but complete surrender of the city that has been the empire's heart for over 11 centuries. His offer to grant Constantine sovereignty over the Peloponnese or other territories provides generous terms by contemporary standards, yet represents the extinction of the empire whose preservation justifies the emperor's existence. The talks collapse when Constantine delivers his final response. He will surrender everything except Constantinople itself, which he will defend until death takes the decision from his hands. The bombardment that begins on April 12, 1453, introduces warfare of unprecedented intensity to the ancient battlefield where Romans had fought for 13 centuries. Aubur's great cannon, positioned opposite the strongest section of the landward wall, hurls stone balls weighing over 600 pounds with sufficient force to shatter masonry that had resisted every previous assault. Smaller guns maintain continuous fire that prevents effective repairs while creating clouds of dust and debris that obscure the defenders' vision and choke their lungs with powdered stone. Yet the walls that Theodosius II had constructed 1,000 years earlier prove remarkably resilient even against these modern weapons. Their triple-layered construction, with rubble cores faced by massive stone blocks, absorbs artillery impact more effectively than Mehmed's engineers had anticipated. The defenders' counterattacks, led by Constantine himself, repair breaches faster than Ottoman guns can create them during the siege's early weeks. Most significantly, the garrison's morale remains high as defenders recognize that they fight not merely for political independence but for the survival of their civilization. The emperor's personal leadership during these desperate weeks transforms him from merely competent ruler into heroic figure worthy of the empire's greatest traditions. Each morning finds Constantine inspecting the walls, encouraging the defenders, and sharing their dangers without regard for imperial dignity. His purple robes, torn by fragments of Ottoman artillery, symbolize an empire that maintains its essential character even as its material foundations crumble. His refusal to accept defeat despite overwhelming odds inspires loyalty that transcends rational calculation. The siege's turning point comes on April 22nd when Mehmed achieves what no previous besieger had managed. He transports ships overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing the great chain that had protected the harbour for centuries. This engineering feat, requiring the construction of a wooden roadway across the hills of Galata, demonstrates both Ottoman technical capability and the Sultan's determination to overcome every obstacle through innovative thinking. The appearance of Ottoman vessels in the supposedly secure harbour forces the defenders to divide their already inadequate strength between landward and seaward walls. Constantine's response to this crisis reveals both his tactical competence and the limitations imposed by insufficient resources. His attempt to destroy the Ottoman fleet through a night attack demonstrates sound strategic thinking but fails due to inadequate coordination and premature discovery by alert Turkish sentries. The emperor's decision to continue defending both walls despite his reduced manpower reflects realistic assessment of alternatives. Surrendering either position would make the other indefensible. As May progresses and Ottoman pressure intensifies, signs multiply that the siege approaches its climax. Mehmed's engineers complete underground tunnels designed to collapse sections of the wall through explosive charges. Though Serbian mining expert John Grant successfully destroys most of these attempts through countermining operations, Ottoman artillery achieves several significant breaches that require increasingly desperate measures to defend. Most ominously, the defenders' ammunition runs low, while Ottoman supplies appear unlimited. The final assault begins before dawn on May 29, 1453, as Ottoman forces launch coordinated attacks against every section of the city's defences. The first wave, consisting of irregular troops and recent conscripts, serves primarily to exhaust the defenders' ammunition and energy while identifying weak points for subsequent exploitation. The second assault, led by Anatolian regular troops, achieves several penetrations of the outer wall before being repelled by counterattacks that cost the garrison casualties it cannot afford. The decisive third wave brings the elite Janissary corps against walls already weakened by hours of continuous fighting. These professional soldiers, selected in childhood and trained exclusively for warfare, possess both equipment and skills superior to anything the exhausted defenders can match. When a small group of Janissaries discovers an unlocked posting gate in the Kirka Porta section of the wall, they establish a foothold that rapidly expands despite desperate efforts to contain the breach. Constantine the Eleventh's final hour arrives as Ottoman banners appear on the ramparts his ancestors had defended for over a millennium. Rather than retreating to the palace where he might negotiate surrender terms or seek escape by sea, the last Byzantine emperor makes the choice that defines his legacy. Discarding the imperial regalia that might identify his body to enemies seeking trophies, he joins the final defense at the gate where the city's fate will be decided. Contemporary accounts differ regarding the precise details of Constantine's death, but all agree on its essential character. Fighting alongside his remaining guards as ordinary soldiers, rather than directing the battle from safety, the emperor falls defending the wall that had protected his capital for 11 centuries. His body, discovered hours later among heaps of defenders who had died beside him, bears wounds that testify to his courage in facing the overwhelming force that finally conquered the unconquerable city. The conquest of Constantinople that follows represents both military triumph and cultural catastrophe. Ottoman soldiers, following the traditional 3-day period of pillaging granted to forces that capture a city by storm, systematically loot the remaining treasures of Byzantine civilization. Hagia Sophia, greatest church in Eastern Christendom, becomes a mosque as Mehmed claims his victory through Islamic prayer in the cathedral where emperors had been crowned for 8 centuries. Yet the Sultan's treatment of the conquered population reveals the complex character that made him both destroyer and preserver of Byzantine heritage. His protection of the Orthodox Patriarch, his appointment of Genadios Scholarios as head of the Orthodox millet system, and his preservation of many Byzantine administrative practices demonstrate recognition that conquest alone cannot create effective governance. The Ottoman Empire that emerges from this victory incorporates essential elements of the civilization it has destroyed. As the sun sets on May 29, 1453, it illuminates a transformed world. The Roman Empire that had endured for over 2,000 years in its various forms has finally ended. The last emperor lies dead among his people, having chosen honor over survival in the final test of imperial virtue. Yet in that choice, Constantine the Eleventh ensures that the empire's end becomes worthy of its beginning, a conclusion that honors, rather than betrays, the traditions he inherited from Constantine the Great. The echoes of this final day will resonate through centuries as the story of an empire that preferred extinction to dishonor, of an emperor who died as a soldier rather than living as a subject, and of a city whose fall marked the end of an age. Though the walls of Constantinople have fallen, the memory of their defense will outlive the empires that succeed them. The silence that settles over Constantinople in the wake of conquest carries within it the end of more than an empire. As Ottoman soldiers make their way through streets where purple-robed emperors had processed for over a millennium, they walk among the ruins of a dream that had sustained human civilization since the days when Constantine first gazed across the Bosphorus and envisioned his new Rome. Yet even in this moment of apparent finality, the seeds of continuity take root in ways that neither conqueror nor conquered could fully comprehend. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where Mehmed II offers prayers of thanksgiving for his victory, the very walls that echo with Islamic invocations still bear witness to centuries of Christian worship. The mosaics that Byzantine artists had created to glorify Christ and his saints, now covered by Ottoman plaster, wait in darkness for future generations to rediscover. The architectural genius that had moved Justinian to declare he had surpassed Solomon continues to inspire awe in rulers who worship a different god, but recognize transcendent beauty when they encounter it. The Orthodox Patriarch Gennadios Scholarios, appointed by the Sultan to govern the empire's former Christian subjects, carries forward an unbroken chain of apostolic succession that stretches back to the earliest days of the Church. Under the millet system that Mehmed establishes, Orthodox Christianity not only survives, but maintains its institutional structure, its theological traditions, and its spiritual authority over millions of believers who will carry Byzantine religious heritage into an uncertain future. Far to the north, in the forests and rivers of Muscovy, another transformation unfolds that will echo through centuries. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, gazes southward toward the fallen queen of cities and sees in its destruction not an ending but an opportunity. His marriage to Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, provides more than dynastic legitimacy. It creates a mystical connection between Moscow and Constantinople, between the Russia that is emerging and the empire that has passed away. The doctrine of the Third Rome, formulated by the monk Philotheus of Pskov, crystallizes this connection in words that will shape Russian identity for centuries to come. Two Romes have fallen, he writes. The third stands, and a fourth there will never be. Moscow becomes the heir not merely to Byzantine political traditions, but to its spiritual mission as the guardian of Orthodox Christianity in a world where the original centers of the faith have fallen to Muslim conquest. The Russian court adopts Byzantine ceremonies, Byzantine titles, Byzantine concepts of sacred kingship that transform Muscovite princes into czars, whose authority derives not merely from military conquest, but from divine appointment. The double-headed eagle that had symbolized Byzantine imperial power spreads its wings over the Russian steppes, carrying with it memories of Constantinople's former glory and promises of Orthodox resurgence. Yet the Byzantine legacy extends far beyond the borders of Orthodox lands. In the libraries and workshops of the West, where Renaissance humanism flowers in Italian cities, Byzantine scholars who fled the Ottoman conquest bring with them treasures more precious than gold or silver. The manuscripts they carry contain the accumulated wisdom of classical antiquity, preserved through the empire's darkest hours and now shared with Western intellectuals hungry for ancient learning. Scholars like Gemistos Plethon and Cardinal Bessarion bridge the gap between East and West, translating Greek texts that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. Plato's complete works, preserved in Byzantine monasteries, while the West knew only fragments, influenced Renaissance philosophers who reshape European thought. The mathematical treatises of ancient geometers, the historical works of classical historians, the philosophical dialogues of Athenian sagism, all flow westward in the baggage of Byzantine refugees, enriching Western culture even as their homeland passes into memory. In the workshops of Venice and Florence, artists study Byzantine techniques that had kept alive the flame of classical beauty through the medieval centuries. The use of gold in religious paintings, the rendering of divine light in sacred art, the creation of mosaics that seem to glow with inner radiance. These skills, perfected in Constantinople's churches, find new expression in Western masterpieces that will inspire viewers for generations to come. The legal legacy of Byzantium proves equally enduring. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, refined through centuries of imperial practice, provides the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe and beyond. The concepts of due process, the rights of citizens, the limitations on sovereign power, all trace their development through Byzantine jurisprudence to the legal frameworks that govern modern nations. Even the empire's administrative innovations survive its political extinction. The theme system's integration of military and civilian authority influences the development of provincial governance throughout Europe. The diplomatic protocols developed in Constantinople's palace halls establish precedents for international relations that persist into the modern era. The financial instruments created by Byzantine merchants facilitate trade networks that span continents. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, where Orthodox monks continue their ancient prayers, the spiritual traditions of Byzantium live on unchanged by political upheaval. The hesychast practices that had flourished during the empire's final centuries provide techniques for mystical prayer that transcend national boundaries and cultural divisions. The theological synthesis that Orthodox thinkers had achieved, balancing reason and revelation, philosophy and faith, continues to offer wisdom to seekers in every generation. The music that had filled Byzantine churches, the haunting melodies of Orthodox chant, the complex harmonies that seemed to carry earthly voices into heavenly realms, echoes still in Orthodox services from Russia to Greece, from Serbia to America. These sounds, unchanged for centuries, create bridges across time that connect modern worshippers with the faithful who once gathered in Hagia Sophia to hear the same ancient prayers. As you contemplate this vast tapestry of survival and transformation, picture the final irony of Byzantine history. The empire that had seemed to end in catastrophic defeat reveals itself, in the longer perspective of centuries, to have achieved a victory more complete than any military conquest. Its influence, no longer contained within political boundaries, spreads across continents and through generations, shaping civilizations that its emperors could never have imagined. The walls of Constantinople lie broken, their stones repurposed for Ottoman buildings, but the invisible walls of culture, faith, and learning that Byzantium had constructed prove more enduring than any mortar. The empire that called itself Roman until its final day achieves in death the universal influence that had eluded it in life. In libraries and churches, in legal codes and artistic traditions, in the prayers of the faithful and the discoveries of scholars, the Byzantine Empire lives on. The purple that Constantine the Eleventh wore to his death has faded, but the golden thread of Byzantine influence continues to weave through the fabric of human civilization, connecting past to present, east to west, earth to heaven, in patterns of beauty and meaning that transcend the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. The dream that began with Constantine's vision on the shores of the Bosphorus finds its fulfillment not in political dominion but in the immortal realm of human achievement and spiritual aspiration, where empires never fall and the most beautiful cities exist forever in the grateful memory of those who inherit their gifts.